You may even get tired of winning, and you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore. Mr. President, it's too much. And I'll say, no, it isn't. We have to keep winning. We have to win more. We're going to win more.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Astrolabe, a special edition, a Saturday edition. We are Saturlabing today. I started listening to the Scott Bessent interview the other day. I found this interview from back in the day, the yesteryear of 2023, before he was ever rumored to be Treasury Secretary or involved with Trump in any way, in any capacity. And I actually had watched this interview before, and I think I probably watched it around the time that he was announced. And so it was wild for me going back and listening to it in viewing it through new eyes, through a new lens here of everything that's happened over the past couple of years and what we've learned about the way he views the world and the sort of global financial system, US dollar system reset that he envisions. So I started listening to it and I was like pausing and taking notes. The way I take notes is I have a conversation with Grok about it. I was pausing and like, I was, okay, there's so much. There's so much here that's happening. We need to talk about this on the show. So since I was not able to do a show yesterday because we had stuff going on here at the house, we had a handyman show up from the landlords and doing an inspection of the house and everything because we just re-upped the lease. And he got here late and it took him longer than expected. And so got late enough and I was like, I either have to do the voice chat or I have to do a stream. And the voice chat in the King Pill Discord, that is for the people who are paying to be there. So they're the ones who get tended to first. So I did not do a stream yesterday, just did a voice chat. And it was a good one. We had a good time. If you guys are not in the Discord, you missed out. Go join it, kingpill.com. Also, make sure you get your ChudCon tickets. We're getting pretty close now. So if you don't have Labor Day weekend plans and you want to come make some internet friends and experience the Cyberbullies' first ever IRL event. It'll be in Northern Virginia. You just want to fly into, I mean, best case scenario probably for you is going to be flying in and out of Dulles or just driving to Northern Virginia, wherever you are. Once you purchase your tickets at chudconevent.com, we will reach out to you and let you know the location, the exact location, and the beautiful hills of Northern Virginia. Come join us. It'll be a grand old time. Go to chudconevent.com. I see a number of people in the chat who have already confirmed their ChudCon tickets. So if you want to come hang out with us, chudconevent.com. Cooper will be there, by the way. That was just confirmed. So if you'd like to come meet the elusive, mysterious king of the Zoomers himself, chudconevent.com. Labor Day weekend. So King Pill Discord, ChudCon, Scott Bessent. So I was like, we got to do a watch through of this interview because there are so many little nuggets there that we're gonna consume all of Scott Bessent's nuggets tonight. So many things that we're clarifying, we're validating. You could see the message was there. For those who might have been able to predict the future and expect him as the Treasury Secretary, you could have predicted a lot of what's happened so far if you had just watched that interview back in 2023. And so then once I put it in here, then there was a Promethean action video that popped up today that I was like, oh, that's like a perfect setup for the conversation. And then I was like, I should go run through the bookmarks real quick and see if there was anything else that would be pertinent. And I wound up with more than I expected. So. Tuck in, boys and girls. We are going to have a whopper of a lab tonight, talking about Big Gay Patton himself. Now I've got a couple of contributions. The Pay Piggies have lined up. Pale Morning Dude with 100 kicks and Screwed Up Nevsky with 50 kicks. Thank you to all of you guys who resubscribed over on Kick. That's a great way to support the show. Guaranteed recurring revenue is really, really nice to have. So a subscription, it's only $5 on Kick, but that creates a nice floor, a nice predictable floor on the monthly income. And Kick only takes 5% out of for their platform cut, unlike YouTube or Rumble. Rumble takes 50%. YouTube takes like 30. And then we've got one of these bad boys, Dankus Vanilla.
Been working harder than an ugly stripper lately to pay that white pill prescription fee, and I'm happy to do so. Go make more Ericssons.
Thank you, sir. $114.88. Ben Shapiro on 2X, by the by here, he just says, there aren't any decent Linux phones, and buying into the Apple world is so damn convenient. I can copy and paste stuff from my phone to my laptop and back. My headphones auto-switch to whatever's playing sound. All my passwords auto-sync, etc. Yes, that is the biggest thing for me, why I stick with the Apple ecosystem, because it's just so damn convenient. Takes a load off the processors. That can be dedicated to other things, and it's definitely gotten worse, like, than it used to be relative to your day-to-day experience. It pisses me off a lot more than it used to, but I stick with it just because I'm captive. Apple ecosystem is retard maxing. That's a really good point. Really good point, Ian. Apple ecosystem retard maxing, 100%. That is it for me. It's kind of funny how it doesn't pick up my black shirt here, so I just look like a hovering head down here. That's kind of funny. All right. Now, real quick, during the pre-show, Ben Shapiro on 2X dropped this. The Onion from August 28, 2002. Exiled American king triumphantly returns to Washington. Look at the image. I think it's intentionally really low res. But 2002, look at that image. After nearly 3 decades in exile, King William IV returned to the U.S. to reclaim his throne Monday. Good people of America, said the newly restored monarch, speaking from a White House balcony, let the word be spread throughout the land that your king has returned. Prepare a feast, added His Majesty amid a fanfare of trumpets. Citizens were overjoyed by the monarchic restoration. Huzzah, said Diane Sowell of State College, Pennsylvania. At long last, we are rid of that corrupt, antiquated system of government known as democracy. A system that has done nothing but maintain the status quo of political inequality, economic stagnation, and social injustice. Our good king will change all of that. So true! How did they know? Overthrown in 1973 by democratic extremists, King William fled to the Mediterranean island of Malta, where he had lived for the past 29 years. Throughout his time in exile, the king closely monitored the political climate in America, waiting for the right moment to return. When word of the September 11 attacks reached him, he decided he could wait no longer. Assembling a small traveling party, he set sail across the Atlantic to reclaim his throne. On August 20, following a months-long detour-filled odyssey over land and sea, the king and his traveling companions arrived at Annapolis, Maryland, where he revealed his true identity to a naval detachment and persuaded it to accompany him to Washington. As the royal entourage neared the capital, word spread that the long-deposed monarch was on his way back. By the time William reached the D.C. city limits Monday, an estimated 400,000 elated supporters had amassed along the banks of the Potomac River to show their support for the bloodless coup. My devoted subjects, the time has come to right a great wrong so many years old, the sovereign told the cheering crowd. Scores remain to be settled. So true. And in time, all will receive their due. But for now, let the word go forth that your king is come. Marching up the National Mall, flanked by a 2,500-unit regiment of loyalist troops, King William entered the National Archives, where he smashed a display case with his wooden staff and retook the crown, scepter, and red, white, and blue ermine robes of his office. The king then stormed into the Capitol building, the former site of the Royal Aviary, and announced his return, formally dissolving Congress by royal decree. He ordered all legislators to return to their homes with the exception of Senator Strom Thurmond, whom the king locked in the royal dungeon for his role in the 1973 ouster. This is so good. According to a spokesman for King William, the 50 state governors will be permitted to retain their posts under the revised title of Lord until further notice from the Crown. President Bush will also be allowed to retain his title, though he will function in a figurehead capacity with no real power. Watch this drive. Buoyed by the news of the restored constitutional monarchy, the Dow Jones soared past 14,000 Monday. Minutes after the closing bell, however, the resurrected Ministry of Finance closed down the stock market, announcing that the generosity of the royal treasury will provide for all. Beltway pundits see the restoration as a welcome development. Under democracy, millions of needy Americans slipped through the cracks, McLaughlin Group commentator Eleanor Clift said. King William will, by God's grace, see all monies fairly distributed, and the truly deserving will be helped. Chris Matthews, host of MSNBC's Hardball, applauded the king's return but questioned some of his policies. As much as I support welfare reform, Matthews said, replacing it with a nationwide network of debtors' prisons, as His Majesty plans, strikes me as a little extreme. Still, it can't be much worse than what we've had. Oh, it's the playbook. Our nation is whole once more, said King William, speaking from his horse-drawn carriage during a procession down Pennsylvania Avenue. God save the king of these good United States of America. This is the world we're gonna live in, boys and girls. I like saying boys and girls. It reminds me of Ben Shapiro. Or gang. This is the world we're gonna live in, gang. Ben Shapiro on 2X says, if you think this is good, you should have a look at this book, Star-Spangled Crown. What is this? The Star-Spangled Crown, a simple guide to the American monarchy. For 240 years, most Americans have identified our country with this government as the embodiment of freedom in the nation itself. Take away the Constitution, Congress, and presidential elections, and not only liberty, but the United States themselves would vanish. Or would they? We have a government that imposes social change from above at breakneck speed, while each presidential election seems to offer even more pathetic choices than the one before. Many are scratching their heads and wondering, not just where are we going, but how did we get here? Is our governmental system itself the leading symbol of the American way of life heading for a meltdown? And if it is, what, if anything, will still be left of our country? Star-Spangled Crown is a book that comes to us from over a century in the future. That feared meltdown has already occurred, but these United States survived the loss of the presidency. Erected on the ruins of our current regime, a monarchy has emerged. Contrary to all of our 21st century notions, it is a thoroughly American institution. How it functions, as and where all governments, including our present one, must function, is the subject of the book. Star-Spangled Crown is not a call for radical change. It's an invitation for serious thought about the realities of civil life that we as a people have spent more than 2 centuries ignoring or avoiding at our ultimate peril. What values shall our society express? Who makes those decisions? By what right do they do so? What is America really? Or, as our 22nd century author might say, what are the United States? Star-Spangled Crown offers one set of answers from a possible future, but above all, it calls on you to ask the questions in the present. I will be acquiring that book. That sounds extremely interesting. Thank you, Ben Shapiro on 2X. You're a good guy to keep around. You're just the guy who knows things. And so when you're looking for something to know, you just say, "Hey, Ben Shapiro on 2X, give me something to know," and he'll offer you something to know. We got a Trump dance last night in Myrtle Beach. Hot off the presses, fresh and glowing.
Young man, there's no need to feel down. I said, young man.
Oh yeah.
Come off the ground. I said, young man. 'Cause you're in a new town. There's no need.
Imagine being pointed at.
Unhappy young man. There's a place you can go. I said, young man. When you're short on your dough.
He pointed at me. Did you see that? He did it. I swear. Look. See? Yes. Hello, Mr. President. I'm here. Look at this other angle. There will never be another like him. Look at him. Me demonstrating how I slap my wife's ass. He did it again! Yes, Lieutenant Jonathan Kendrick, I love him so much. So much. Look at him. Look at this. Speaking of the president pointing at you, he's done it again. How does he do it? Routinely. Like weekly. We get a new a new Sistine Chapel submission. Logan Hall says they don't want you to know this, but you can just give young white men a future to believe in and not treat them with open contempt. So true. He had them at his fingertips. Listen to this absolute gigapatriot.
I want to support our president. He needs our support now more than ever because he's got a fight on his hands against communism, against liberal, far leftists. He's got to know that the American people still support him.
I want to hear her podcast. Start a live stream, ma'am. Actually, no, don't. No, don't. You don't want to. You don't need to engage in the discourse. Absolute patriot. Speaking of communism, my president knows much about communism, an enemy that we've fought for thousands of years.
It's unhappy. Did you ever see a happy communist? You ever see a communist laugh? I never saw it. I've known communists. They don't laugh. They're very unhappy people. We want to be happy.
I have no words. My president has the words. My president has the best words. He knows how to put them together so perfectly. Whoever would have thought of that? You've never seen a communist laugh. They're unhappy people. We don't want to be communists because we want to be happy. My president makes me happy. Now, speaking of giving young white men a chance, listen to my vice president.
Now, in 1984, just to date myself a little bit, don't hate me, 1 month before I was born, the Wall Street Journal, the voice of big business in the United States of America, proposed, and I quote, a 5-word constitutional amendment. There shall be open borders.
J.D. Vance is taking the war to the Wall Street Journal.
Now, they weren't joking. They weren't being tongue-in-cheek. Because if you look at what they tried to do over the next 40 years, they told you back then exactly what they were trying to do. 16 years later, when I was in high school, right here in Middletown High School, go Middies. The newspaper's lead editorial writer doubled down on that same set of ideas. They said, someone who believes, this is a quote, in the free trade and free movements of capital, they declared, will quite naturally believe in the free movement of labor. That means they're going to ship your jobs overseas and they're going to let anybody who wants to come into the United States of America with no vetting and no care. Being replaced by foreign workers, in other words, it was not an accident, my friends. It was the desired outcome of a generation of American elites. And every single person in this room knows the consequences and what they looked like over a generation right here in Middletown, Ohio. Now, grown up here.
This is just exquisite populist politics. Who would have thought that we would have one of our guys as the vice president delineating in explicit detail how the establishment big business under libertarian auspices opened up the borders, destroyed American labor markets, and partnered up with the global NGO network to also induce white people into destroying themselves. This is what our vice president is running on. And then picking up where he left off, listen to this one. It's on one and a quarter. So if it sounds a little fast, then that's why. Colin Rosh over on YouTube said, you have to be people to be happy people. And, well, communists are not people. Very good point. Very, very good point. To embrace communism is to renounce your claim to personhood. Ben Shapiro on 2X said, remember when Trump and Biden got into an argument about who is the better golfer in the middle of the debate? And Life Support Unpluggers said, I am the Chad Gamer Wojak, and you are the small crying Abustaya. No, you're not based. You're actually cringe. No, you're cringe. There's so much to enjoy about the world today, man. Listen to our vice president.
Up here, I remember when somebody would come to school and tell me that their dad had just found out that he had lost his job. that the factory that employed their parents was going overseas to China or to Mexico. In other cases, American workers didn't just have their jobs destroyed, they got told they were being replaced by a foreign worker, and then they had to train that worker before they got replaced.
This is the guy, supposedly this is the guy who wants to, he's like the subversive Manchurian candidate who's going to get in there and get activated by his Jeet wife and then throw the borders open. This guy who's telling this story right now.
Some of these stories have made national news and they've stuck with me. 3 years after the Wall Street Journal called for the free movement of labor, a computer programmer, not a mill worker, a computer programmer by the name of Kevin Flanagan was let go at the bank that he worked at. And the bank, they told him, you're only going to get your severance package if you trained a foreign replacement to do your job instead. And it's a heartbreaking story because he did it. He dutifully did what he was asked to do. And on his last day, he packed up his things, he walked to the office parking lot, he got in his truck and he shot himself. It's not just Kevin, as you all know. Now, economists have measured the ways in which the opioid crisis exploded in the very locations where jobs were shipped overseas. The open borders demanded by those same people brought some innocent people, of course it did. But we also know that it brought a lot of cartels, it brought the fentanyl trade, and it left us with millions of orphan children being raised by aggrieved grandparents. That was the story, of course, of my mama and papa. Now, the blood of these men and women, these so-called deaths of despair, I'm sure you've heard that phrase, but it's almost too abstract for me. Because the blood of those people, in my view, it pools at the feet of those who would sell out their country for a cheap bottom line.
That's a fucking bar right there. Listen to that one more time.
The blood of these men and women, these so-called deaths of despair, I'm sure you've heard that phrase, but it's almost too abstract for me. Because the blood of those people, in my view, it pools at the feet of those who would sell out their country for a cheap bottom line.
Their blood pools at the feet of those who would sell out their country for a cheap bottom line. Woo!
Our politicians, and frankly the cronies in the private sector, people who didn't want to build in America like Cleveland Cliffs, but people who were happy to build overseas, they got rich, and communities like this one got poor. Politicians, think about this, who came to...
Jeff!
For the white pills and because you got bills and shit.
Man, Dale's amazing. It sounds so realistic. The cadence, the pronunciation, all of it, that's so good. Thank you, Jeff. Patriot. Yes, that is true. Very much do. We've got bills. We got bills to pay. Please help us pay our bills. Send a tip. Give me your tip. Give me all the tips. Tips.kingpill.com. Thank you, Jeff.
Came to Washington with a few $1,000s in their bank account. Left after decades of public service with millions in stock portfolios. And what did all of you get? What did we get? If you were lucky, your neighbor's job got shipped to a foreign country while your tax dollars got shipped to fraudsters. And if you were unlucky,
your jobs got shipped to a foreign country while your tax dollars got shipped to fraudsters. Ah! Imagine thinking that J.D. Vance isn't destined for the White House.
As I know many people in this room were, you were left raising a grandchild while you were mourning the child killed by the very poison brought across that wide open border. But just as it was a policy choice to let that happen, my friends, it was a policy choice to reverse that decline. And in November of...
It was a policy choice. All of that blood that pools at their feet, that blood was a policy choice. And also, you can just do things. Reversing all of that is a policy choice. That's what's happening right now, is all of that is being reversed. It's not going to happen overnight. But the best way to ensure that it keeps being reversed is continuity of government.
Of 2024, you made a choice to reverse 40 years of American decline and make Donald Trump the President of the United States.
I'm chipping.
And I'm not saying it's going to be easy or it's all going to happen overnight, but in just 18 months, we have seen an explosion of rebuilding in the American heartland. We have seen trillions, with a T, trillions of new dollars of investment pour into the United States of America to build new smelters, build new manufacturing facilities, build new mills, build new everything. Under President Trump's leadership, factories...
And those dollars that are coming in, those dollars are going toward productive uses. So this isn't the equivalent of the Fed just helicopter dumping money into the economy. This is actual productive expenditure now.
Factory construction employment has exploded. We've added 83,000 factory construction jobs just since Inauguration Day.
Straight Buster says, remember thinking JD didn't have the sauce yet? Yeah, I'm thinking he's got the sauce now. Oh, baby. Sauce me up, JD. Now, here is today's Promethean action drop, which includes part of one of the clips from JD's speech there. But I also had some other stuff, too, related to Scott Bessent. So she says they're screaming about $40 trillion in debt and a bond market explosion right on schedule ahead of the midterms. But Scott Bessent has a plan that Wall Street and London literally cannot understand because their models have no box for an economy that outgrows its debt. It's literally not possible, right? It's literally not possible to outgrow the American debt. Yeah, watch us, says Scott Bessent.
The 40 trillion U.S. debt and what's being called a bond market explosion are the hottest news in the financial press. It looks to me like creating a financial panic is the next phase of the plan to destroy President Trump ahead of the midterms. But Scott Bessent has a secret plan to crush the speculators. Here's Bessent talking about the debt on Thursday.
The 40 trillion is a big number. And remember, we did not get here in a day. That we were left with a mess. The Biden administration had the highest deficit to GDP in history when we weren't at war or weren't in a recession. For 2025, we brought it down by more than 1%.
And here's J.D. Vance Thursday talking about what he called Scott Bessent's discreet plan to deal with it.
The other thing is that Scott Bessent, the amazing Treasury Secretary, he has had a...
Now, I noticed here that Vance says Bessent, and I keep sometimes people say Bessent, sometimes people say Bessent, and I'm sure that Bessent is probably closer to, it's probably French, I'm guessing. I'm sure that Bessent is probably closer to the original pronunciation, but I'm making a note for myself now to see if I can find Scott himself saying his name, just to know how it's actually pronounced. And when he uses discreet here, there's like two meanings of discreet. There's discreet, which is spelled with E-E-T on the end, which is like, you're like being discreet. You're trying to stay under the radar. And then there's discreet, ending in E-T-E, which means it's like distinct. It actually has specific identifiable components. So he's saying that Scott Bessent has, he's a little vocab word here. He's saying that Scott Bessent doesn't just have kind of like, I don't know, sort of an idea and he's just kind of making it up as he goes along. No, he has an explicit, discrete plan.
Had a very discreet plan, of course, supported by the President of the United States to get the United...
the subtitles here had the wrong discreet.
Treasury Secretary, he has had a very discreet plan.
Yeah, that's the discreet if you're meaning like furtive or under the radar, not the discreet as in like distinct and identifiable.
Of course, supported by the President of the United States to get the United States to a point where our economy is growing faster than our debt. Mm-hmm. And if you look, we are on track. So even though the debt is too high, even though we inherited this debt bomb from the Biden administration, we actually do have a plan to get the economy growing faster than the debt. And that's the most important thing.
Now, if you're Wall Street...
I mean, they're saying it explicitly. They're not even having to like guess about this. They're saying in explicit terms, our plan is to run the economy hot and grow out of the debt. It's that straightforward and simple.
Banker or a City of London financial predator or a current Democrat, you think this is crazy talk from a snake oil salesman. But if you're honest, you really do have to wonder why Trump's economy keeps proving all of your predictions absolutely wrong. I'm Barbara Boyd, and I've studied the American system economics Trump and Bessent are implementing since
Tell
the
him,
1970s.
maggot grandma.
Today, we're covering three fronts in the same story. First, Scott Bessent's secret plan. Second, why this plan is like Alexander Hamilton put on steroids. Finally, why the global elites will never figure out what Trump and Bessent are doing to them.
Need to see a roided out Alexander Hamilton. AI bros, get to work on that. Roided up Hamilton. Colin Rosh said on YouTube just a little bit ago about the J.D. Vance thing. He said, "This is the Renaissance that avoids the revolution." I like that.
Now, Scott Bessent's secret plan to deal with the debt and inflation is as old as Alexander Hamilton. Issuing credit for productive purposes through a sovereign wealth fund, special government funds, or the banking system is non-inflationary and even deflationary. If credit funds hard commodity output, new infrastructure, technological development, and the new inventions and discoveries which exist on the frontiers of present science, there's no inflation.
You see what the distinction she's making here, and you'll notice that there's all these different government institutions that have popped up recently that they're funneling capital through. Like there's something called I just completely forgot the name of it. Defense Finance Corporation. Was that what it was? I can't remember, but there's a number of these different, the Export-Import Bank, there's a number of these different financial institutions that are actually providing credit specifically for targeted projects. So this isn't just like printing dollars for financialization schemes. You're issuing credit, but that credit is going directly into, it's being immediately put to work in a productive capacity. So you're borrowing from the future to do something now to raise your ceiling in the future. Not just borrowing from the future because you don't have it right now. You're creating a delta there, because if you do this productive activity now, and then you have to pay the dollars back in the future, the productivity will have outstripped the inflation.
That credit doesn't chase existing goods with new money. It expands the goods available so prices.
That right there. It's not chasing existing goods with new money. If you have more money units and the same number of existing goods, then the price of the existing goods calculated in the money units is going to go up. But what they're doing is they're creating the capacity to generate new goods.
Prices don't rise. Not only that, the upskilling of the labor force necessary for this new economy increases the productive powers of labor. Here's the Treasury Secretary saying just that.
That our strength, in other words, is derived from what we can build. For the nation that cannot produce what it needs is not truly secure. And the nation that reduces its economics to consumption is not truly prosperous. Instead, as Hamilton put it, it is essential to enlarge the sphere of our domestic commerce, because economic security begins at home. It begins with the capacity to build, invent, finance, and scale the industries that will define the next century. Among them, semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, shipbuilding, critical minerals, and pharmaceuticals, to name only a few. More than sectors of the economy, these are sources of our national power, and America must lead.
Sources of our national power. These aren't just like dry, just economic segments to be analyzed on a chart. They are sources of national power.
The economy, these are sources of our national power, and America must lead in each of them. In today's economy, supply chains are the domain in which that leadership is tested. Yet for years, the question that seemed to consume both our political and commercial class was, where is the lowest cost?
There's even more. Up until now, who got credit and who didn't.
So you see this, what he's contrasting here. You got this old system, the one that J.D. Vance connected to the open borders thing, which is we must drive the costs down. We must have lowest possible cost. Versus the Hamiltonian system, which is invest in the components of the system that can produce things at a lower cost. Not just try to get the lowest cost. So then everyone else who's yelling at the Trump administration for not doing more to make costs go down, they're still operating in that old model. They're assuming that the goal here is to get back to the world that the Wall Street Journal and Cato envisioned. We're not going to that world. We're leaving that world behind. We're going into a new world with a totally restructured monetary system that realigns incentives.
Was largely determined by Wall Street's dominance of the Federal Reserve. But now Scott Bessent is putting that credit oversight role back where it belongs, with the president and his Treasury Secretary. That's what his recent interventions on behalf of Japan's currency and in support of U.S. Treasury bonds is all about, and why the speculators are screaming. At the same time, Kevin Warsh is cutting the Fed down to size and figuring out, how do you measure real growth in an economy? That measurement is not the sum of Wall Street speculation on a given day or any other measure for economic activity the Fed currently uses. Inflation happens when credit is diverted into things like Joe Biden's COVID relief program and Joe Biden's Build Back Better, service, and green consumer economy. It's directed at providing handouts and funding services or production which do not advance the economy to a higher level of productivity.
Quick, political strategy tip, perhaps. If you hear something like this and you're like, wait a second, I need to be the very smart boy, and I need to point out the things that Trump's administrations have done that are inflationary, like Joe Biden's Build Back Better. You know, like the response to COVID, that was like super inflationary too. So this isn't just a Democrat thing. Shut the fuck up. Understand who your enemies are. Stop shying away from propaganda. Be a propagandist. Bad things are associated with our enemies. Good things are associated with our friends. Period. Point blank. Everything starts from that. So yes, all the inflation is Biden's fault.
The other cause is the Fed's constant bailouts and asset purchases to keep this and similar financial schemes going. Since neither expands productive activity, they drive prices up. The models being used by Wall Street and London don't have a box for how does an economy grow out of its own debt. They only have boxes for spending less or taxing more. So when Bessent proposes a third option...
They literally don't even have models for this. It's considered an impossibility because it's outside the prescribed frame. The idea that an economy could just outgrow its debt, well, it's never happened before. Of course, it's happened at certain levels of scale. It's probably true that that it hasn't happened at the scale of like a global empire. Sure, yeah. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. If it was to happen, it would look a lot like exactly what Trump and Bessent are doing.
And growing the productive base until the debt shrinks next to it, their spreadsheet just doesn't compute it. What they keep forgetting is that Scott Bessent teaches economic history and has always bet very resourcefully against them. And he's pulling a 200-year program off the shelf. Now, if this is new...
Literally, Scott Bessent's entire financial career has been short-selling the people that he is now fighting from the Treasury Secretary position. He has made himself a billionaire off of shorting their plans.
You can learn a whole lot more about the real factors driving the economy by subscribing to our free newsletter at PrometheanAction.com. Both Bessent and J.D. Vance keep referring to Alexander Hamilton as their guy.
I don't remember if Bessent is technically a billionaire or not, but like, you know what I mean.
Freaking all the field modern economists totally out. But Hamilton is the greatest economic revolutionary in history. Unlike Karl Marx or Milton Friedman, his revolution worked. After the Revolutionary War, our new nation was flat broke. The new states and war veterans were demanding payment on what were essentially worthless IOUs. Hamilton paid off the old war debts, state and federal, at full value using government bonds. The bonds were longer term, paid interest from tariff revenues dedicated to paying them, and they were tradable.
And what was it that made them, what made that? So the individual states had what was essentially worthless paper. They're on the hook for these debts, but they didn't have the capacity to actually pay them off. Or if they did, it was going to be substantially inhibiting to them. He used the creation of this new national state and the promise of this engineered financial structure or economic structure as the sales pitch for the credibility of the federal government, such that people would be willing to invest in it because they see it as a credible entity that will be able to pay off its debts. And it will be better suited for paying off those debts than the individual states would be. So the credibility and power of the federal government was key to making this happen.
Then he built a national bank and allowed people to use their bonds to buy into the bank, which financed only real production, merchants, tradesmen, factories, infrastructures, inventions. That's the same principle Scott Bessent just talked about, making sure the credit exists to fuel productive growth, which is the only real purpose of credit. Not money, falsely disguised as credit, and magically producing more money with no production supporting it. You can go to the White House webpage and read Scott Bessent's secret plan. It's there, spelled out publicly, in the president's executive orders to rebuild our economy. They bring back our industrial and manufacturing base, which Wall Street and London shipped overseas, and they bring it back on a new, modern platform. They also launched the economy of the future, involving large-scale use of nuclear power and revolutionary fusion power. You'll also see the plans for a colony on the moon by 2028 and crash funding for new breakthrough science and technological discoveries. Now, competent economists will tell you that for every $1 invested in advanced scientific programs like the Apollo Moon program, the economy gets $8 to $10 back in economic output.
So every $1 invested in programs like the space race or whatever, you get $8 to $10 worth of productivity out of it. Now, who cares if that's the exact number or whatever? You know, you're trying to divine patterns from the ether, and you're going to get approximately correct. Either way, it naturally follows. It makes intuitive sense that investing, using credit productively, think of it on on a personal level, like having a piece of machinery. You get a piece of machinery that enables you to do more work and build more, do bigger jobs. So you take out debt against that piece of machinery so that you get that machinery now so you can start doing those bigger jobs now and making that income now. And then you're arbitraging the difference between what the debt costs to service and the increased productive capacity that you have. So the more productive that you make that machinery or that asset that you're acquiring with the debt, the better that picture looks. But if you're going into debt for, if you're going into debt for something that isn't going to increase your productive capacity, I can't think of something off the top of my head, but then that debt is actually the way it gets monetized, and that's the way that the money supply grows. Then now you have a worse ratio of productive goods to currency units. The currency units have increased, the productive goods capacity has not. So you need to inflate that productive goods capacity even with or faster than the inflation of the currency units.
This is the stuff the mainstream media doesn't want you to know or think about. But I'm sure Alexander Hamilton, sitting in his rightful place now, is smiling down on us in approval. Now, on Thursday, Vice President J.D. Vance went
in his rightful place, smiling down on us. So true.
To Milltown, Ohio. That's his home. And he made a fire-breathing takedown of the free trade financiers based on his own experience. Listening to the whole speech will fire you up and I think make you very happy.
Yes.
But here is the vice president talking about the deliberate free trade policies of Wall Street and London, which wiped out his hometown.
They said it was irrational, sentimental, old-fashioned to want to preserve the things that make the United States of America special. What we really needed, they said, was to compete and have complete market integration with every nation of the third world. Places where you could pay wages at pennies on the dollar.
Complete market integration with every third world nation. The vice president thinks that it's a bad thing to have complete market integration with every third world nation.
But didn't have to give your workers health care or good benefits in the process. And anytime somebody dared to put an obstacle in front of that set of ideas, anytime they said, you know what, we need to put tariffs or tough immigration policies to stop that, those people were called backwards, they were called wrong.
And here he is talking about the deaths of despair in his hometown, which followed that.
Economists have measured the ways in which the opioid crisis exploded in the very locations where jobs were shipped overseas. The open borders demanded by those same people brought some innocent people, of course it did. But we also know that it brought a lot of cartels, it brought the fentanyl trade, and it left us with millions of orphan children being raised by aggrieved grandparents. That was the story, of course, of my mama and papa. Now, the blood of these men and women, these so-called deaths of despair, I'm sure you've heard that phrase, but it's almost too abstract for me. Because the blood of those people, in my view, it pools at the feet of those who would sell out their country for a cheap bottom line.
And then he says, what's
Such
happening
a
under
good
Trump
line.
with trillions of investment in production, new factories being built
Reminder.
It's important to segregate
all over the country. Trump with trillions of investment in production, new factories being built all over the country, and manufacturing wages rising along with hiring. And he is able to make this dramatic announcement about the future of his own hometown.
And that brings me to why I'm here today. Because we're not just here to talk about the celebration and the good news and the numbers. We're here to announce that Cleveland Cliffs is making today, right here in Middletown, Ohio, a $1 billion investment in transformational manufacturing right here in our home.
Now, the elite free traders who got in
BFD.
Middletown are the same people who said tariffs would create inflation. The Iran war would create a paralyzing oil shock. Halting illegal immigration would create a massive labor shortage. They've been wrong every single time because they don't understand real economics. They're mocked.
Imagine being so retarded that you sit there and get mogged on the internet by the MAGA grannies. They're just like, you're so retarded. You're wrong about everything.
Measurements are for a world where resources are fixed and prices are endlessly manipulated on that basis. That's the world Donald Trump is driving out of existence. If the vice president keeps giving these kinds of speeches and the president, Scott Bessent, keep implementing Hamilton's policies, the midterms will be theirs. Getting this message out widely will make that victory possible. That's our job at Promethean Action, and I hope you can contribute as much as you can to help us grow. This has been your Saturday Wrap. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so a couple other clips here from Scott Bessent. First of all, talking about, we just passed the $40 trillion mark on the debt. And I got to say, before I play this clip, big shout out to Tom Luongo for, every once in a while someone says a thing and it's just like, as soon as you hear it, it flips a switch in your brain and you never look at the world the same again. He gave me one of those several months ago when he said, everybody talks about the debt number. And then occasionally you'll get the people who will talk about like the revenues. So they'll talk about the deficit and kind of, and sort of, qualify that debt number a little bit, but nobody ever talks about the assets on the balance sheet. How bad the debt is, how bad the deficit is, both of those things mean very, very different things depending on the condition of the balance sheet. So what assets does the United States have at its disposal? What are those assets properly valued at? And are they being properly valued right now? Or do we have, for example, industrial capacity? You might see that as like a balance sheet number. An asset that the United States have is theoretical industrial capacity. Is America's industrial capacity being properly valued right now? What about all the legal and business rails that the entire global market runs on that are rooted in America? Is that being properly valued? Or has its value been artificially depressed for a long time to make it look like there's a debt crisis when there actually isn't? If we were to, say, refinance some of these assets, if we were to mark them to market, then what does the debt picture look like? So everyone's chimping out about the 40 trillion number. And I basically stopped caring about the debt and the deficit as soon as Luongo said that. It's not that they don't matter. It's that they only matter to the extent that they're properly contextualized.
There's nothing magic about the 40 trillion number, and we can grow our way out of that. So, but what we do want to signal is I think that there's been a lot of misinformation in terms of what's going on with the deficit, what's going on with the deficit to GDP. We actually had a fiscal consolidation for the calendar year 2025. We were at about 5.7% of GDP. And one of the things that's temporary here that's influencing the deficit has been these tariff refunds. And we won't have to do that again. And the ambassador...
So, in other words, the deficit now is higher than it would have been right now otherwise, because they had to refund all of that tariff money after the Supreme Court ruled against them. So that's like a one-time expense now, and I'm going to have another clip of him talking about that here in just a moment.
Greer, through the 301 process, is re-implemented, and the Ambassador Greer, through the 301 process, is re-implementing the same level of tariffs, and I would expect that our 2026 tariff income is going to be roughly what it was in 25. And
so he's saying that they're just implementing in terms of dollar amount, the effect of the tariffs that they're re-implementing according to the process the Supreme Court directed them toward. Those tariffs are going to generate the same amount of revenue that the other ones did. They just have a different name. They're calculated differently, but you wind up at the same number. So he's saying his expectation is that the 2026 tariff revenue is going to be the same as the 2025 revenue. So they took in that 2025 revenue from tariffs. A chunk of it they had to refund back to the companies. But then they're going to be just taking that money right back from them again, starting in 2026 and going forward.
And we're going to be able to keep that in terms of the budget consolidation. The other big item in the budget that we're seeing is the hit that we're taking from to revenues for the immediate expensing of factories and of equipment and farm structures. And I think that if people sit back and think that's not government spending, that is actually an investment in the future. And
So what he's referring to here is, as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, all of the big capital expenditures, I think it was for the next 5 years, they were able to pull forward all of that expensing and take it all in 1 year. So it's substantially reducing their tax burden. All of the companies, all of the organizations, people who are engaging in these big capital expenditure projects, building out factories and developing new industries and everything, all of that equipment, all of the vehicles, all of the materials and everything that they're spending on, they get to expense all of that. So that's lost tax revenue for the federal government. So in a sense, you could think of that as being federal spending that's worsening the deficit. So yes, in the short period, the deficit looks worse than it would have been had they not offered that expensing. But if they hadn't offered that expensing, then they wouldn't get as much development. So he's saying we're taking this extra expense on as the federal government now because they're going to take advantage of that, rapidly develop all of these new plants and factories and facilities and industries, and they're going to develop all of this, which is then in turn going to yield far more tax revenue down the line. So if you're just looking at the deficit in isolation, without considering these other factors, are, you could say, like our real deficit. The nominal deficit is this, but our real deficit is much lower, if not disappeared already.
We're increasing the tax base, and that is what measures the wealth of a nation, is the ability to increase after-tax return on capital. So we're pulling back the
definition of the wealth of a nation is the degree to which you can increase after-tax return on capital. There's a little line for you to keep in mind if you're thinking about how your Treasury Secretary views the world. The wealth of a nation is the ability for that nation to increase after-tax return on capital for its constituents.
Think of it as pulling back the slingshot here. We have a lot of potential energy that will turn into kinetic energy during this year, next year, as these factories come online.
So do you think we've seen peak deficit during this administration?
I think there's a very, very good chance we have. That we are going to be laser focused, as I said, O&D Director Vogt, myself, the President, that combined with the Vice President's Fraud Task Force, where I think we could save several $100 billion. There's nothing.
So several $100 billion from the Fraud Task Force as well. That's another factor to be considered in here. So as you're projecting the deficit going forward, it's looking very, very rosy. Is what you asked him was, have we hit peak deficit for this administration? Or will it only be going down going forward? And I'd say, if not this year, next year will be peak deficit. Then here was this quote from him the other day regarding the tariff refunds that they implemented these tariffs on Liberation Day. All of the American companies had to pay these tariffs into the federal government. Then the Supreme Court ruled against them, so they have to turn around and refund all of those tariffs to those companies. Scott Bessent is fucking pissed about this.
What it says is that the Democratic attorney generals who filed a ridiculous lawsuit against his administration wanted the money to go back to the payer of record. So that is corporate welfare. The American people had that money. If I hear another Democratic legislator make the inane remark, the American people should get the money, the American people had the money in the U.S. Treasury, and we were forced to give it back. But using the 301s, which have survived more than 5,000 suits, that we will get that tariff income back. But what you are seeing is that we don't know the discount that Target got from the Chinese suppliers. So, this is a corporate bonanza, which I said it would be at the time. What it says.
You know how pissed he is? He's so pissed that he said attorney generals. He said Democrat attorney generals, not attorneys general. And if you know Scott Bessent, if he was cool-headed, that's not a mistake that he would have made. And what he's implying here with Target is, so you have these like major corporations that had to pay these tariffs into the federal government, and then they're getting refunded. So they're going to get refunded, but also they had their suppliers in China for the goods that were tariffed, and those suppliers gave them a discount to accommodate for the expense of the tariffs. But he says we don't know what that is. So you see here how the Democrat attorneys general essentially were just getting an extra disbursement from the Treasury to companies like Target. Yeah, you can tell he's pissed. He never gesticulates like that. Yeah, it'll be interesting when we get to the interview here. You'll notice how lively he is. The man is a spitfire. You'll see him when you see him talking in public, he's very, very composed, very distinguished, very professorial, but he's a spitfire. We'll get to that here in just a minute. Check this out. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston published a study that showed industries most affected by tariffs, quote, experience significantly greater labor productivity growth. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston is saying industries most affected by tariffs experience significantly greater labor productivity growth. The paper suggests that this caused tariffs to have a smaller inflationary impact. Trump vindicated per usual. To be anti-tariff is just to reveal yourself as like being incapable of doing temporal calculations or something. Or multivariate analysis. Duffhead!
Just slammed into live time. I am all caught up. Pay your goddamn white pill fees, Satterlabians.
Thank you, Duffhead! That's a wild ride, isn't it? When you're listening at like 2 or 2x and all of a sudden you wham! right into live, and you're like, oh man, everyone's drunk. Yeah, so the industries that were most affected by tariffs had greater labor productivity, meaning that their output increased disproportionately, which made the tariffs actually be less inflationary. If only we'd had a fine gentleman named Donald John Trump, who could have told us that. Greater labor productivity. Yeah. Interesting. What do they mean by this? We're going to start the Labor Party here. And then here, Scott Bessent says, any remaining tie to Tehran will hasten a nation's economic oblivion, whether that tie be purposefully constructed or willfully ignored. Now, interestingly, a nation. Which nation? Any nation. If you are a nation who has a tie to Tehran, whether you have purposefully made that tie or you're just pretending that it doesn't exist, your nation will be economically obliterated. Trump said, no one is given the Islamic Republic of Iran. Notice again, Islamic Republic of Iran. Nobody has given them a greater opportunity to make a deal than me. Tragically for them, they have failed to take it. Therefore, today, I am announcing the, all caps, most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country. This will be economic warfare and isolation on an unprecedented scale. Their navy is gone. Their air force is destroyed. Their military factories are now rubble. Their currency is worthless and their country is hanging by a thread. Today, I am also announcing that any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to provide any type of lifeline to Iran will itself face tremendous economic consequences. Oil smuggling, swap lines, cash transfers, exchange houses, ship registries, front companies. It all needs to stop now. You know who you are. This will be an economic D-Day, and we need all of our allies to stand with the United States of America to isolate and defeat the Iran threat. So this is a message being sent to whom? We need all of our allies to stand with the United States of America. This is a message being sent to our allies. These maniacs are on the ropes, and these historic measures will cripple them in their ability to project terror worldwide. Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. Thank you for your attention in this matter. President Donald J. Trump, have you heard of him? Greatest president of my lifetime. Yeah, Ozarker Pleb, I'm going to miss him so much. So much. So, let's get a little, what would you call this? Like, there's a lot of these accounts that have these really actually very insightful, great breakdowns of complicated financial mechanics or whatever, the globalists and such, but it's very obviously AI written, or at least honed by AI. So as I read it, I'm like, okay, this is good information being presented to me with the AI accent. There's a lot of these. I find them very interesting. This is one of them, the Debriefing 17. 17, huh? What do they mean by that? The Treasury is doing the Fed's job. Nobody asked the Fed. On Tuesday, the U.S. Treasury announced it was doubling the size of its long-term bond buyback program starting September 9. Within hours, $820 billion flowed into gold and silver. Gold hit record highs. Here's what happened and why the market moved that fast. What a buyback is. The U.S. government borrows money by selling bonds. When it sells a 30-year bond, it's promising to pay you back in 30 years plus interest. A buyback is when the government buys those bonds back before they mature. It goes into the market and says, I know I owe you in 2054, but I'll pay you now. When the government buys its own long-term bonds, it puts cash into the market and pulls long-term debt out. That pushes long-term interest rates down. It's the same mechanical effect as what the Federal Reserve does when it buys bonds, what they call quantitative easing. Except this isn't the Federal Reserve doing it, this is the Treasury Department. Why that matters? Managing interest rates across the yield curve has traditionally been the Federal Reserve's job. The Fed is supposed to be independent. It sets interest rates based on inflation and employment data, not on what the White House wants. The Treasury Department, on the other hand, reports directly to the President. The Secretary of the Treasury is a cabinet member. When the Treasury buys bonds, it is the executive branch managing interest rates. Same mechanism, different chain of command. And the Treasury just doubled the program. Now, add everything else that happened this week. It wasn't the only thing the Treasury did. On Sunday, Treasury published the proposed rules for how stablecoins, digital dollars, will be regulated. Every stablecoin issuer in America must be licensed. Every foreign stablecoin that wants to reach American consumers must come from a country that has a deal with the United States. And every licensed stablecoin issuer must hold U.S. Treasury bonds as reserves. Read that last part again. Every licensed stablecoin issuer must hold U.S. Treasury bonds as reserves. The government just created a new class of mandatory bond buyers. If you want to issue digital dollars, you must buy government debt to back them. On Monday, the Treasury International Capital data showed that foreign governments sold $29 billion in Treasury bills in June alone. The traditional buyers of American debt, foreign central banks, are leaving. Not entirely true, overstates that a little bit. $29 billion is actually not that much. Anyway, so Tuesday, Treasury doubled the buyback program. The government is stepping in to buy its own bonds as the old buyers exit. Also Tuesday, Treasury and the IRS proposed new rules restricting tax credits by immigration status. Last week, Congress banned the Federal Reserve from issuing a digital dollar. The Fed cannot compete with the private stablecoin system the Treasury is building. Also last week, FinCEN, a Treasury bureau, killed the requirement for American companies to report who owns them. The same FinCEN, same bureau, same week, issued a record $125 million fine against UBS for not watching its own transactions closely enough. So here's what the Treasury did in 1 week. Wrote the rules for the digital dollar, created mandatory Treasury bond buyers through stablecoin reserve requirements, doubled its own bond buyback program as foreign buyers left, issued the largest bank fine in its category's history, killed a transparency rule for domestic companies, and restricted tax benefits by citizenship status. And the IRS, which sits inside Treasury, helped trace cartel money in a narco-terrorism case 2 weeks ago. Here's what the Federal Reserve did in the same week. Nothing. Where is the Fed? The Federal Reserve is not writing the stablecoin rules. Treasury is. The Federal Reserve is not chartering the stablecoin issuers. The OCC, a Treasury bureau, is. The Federal Reserve is not managing long-term interest rates through buybacks. Treasury is. The Federal Reserve is not enforcing anti-money laundering law. FinCEN, a Treasury bureau, is. The Federal Reserve is not issuing sanctions. OFAC, a Treasury bureau, is. The Federal Reserve is not setting the rules for the digital dollar. It is prohibited by law from even building one. The Federal Reserve still sets one rate, the overnight rate that banks charge each other for short-term loans. That power hasn't been touched. But everything else that matters in the financial system right now, digital currency enforcement, bank chartering, debt management, sanctions, and now yield curve management, is being done by Treasury. The Fed wasn't fired. The Fed wasn't overruled. The Fed was routed around. Nobody revoked its authority. Nobody amended the Federal Reserve Act. They just built the entire next generation of financial architecture in agencies the Fed doesn't control, using laws the Fed doesn't administer, and then banned the Fed from the one new area where it might have reasserted itself. Why gold moved? The market saw the double buyback and did the math. If Treasury is buying its own bonds to manage interest rates, and Treasury is also creating a new class of mandatory bond buyers through stablecoin rules, and foreign governments are selling, then the buyer of last resort for American government debt is becoming the American government itself, plus private companies that are required by law to hold it. Gold is the asset that sits outside that entire system. You can't sanction it, you can't freeze it, you can't require anyone to hold it as reserves. It doesn't need a license, a charter, or a reciprocal arrangement. Little oversimplified, but we continue. $820 billion moved into gold and silver in hours. That's the market saying we see the architecture being built and we're buying the one thing that isn't inside it. Now, what's funny is that it's actually increasingly being built on top of it. That's another thing we'll come back to. So for 75 years, the Federal Reserve was the most powerful financial institution in America. It set interest rates, regulated banks, managed the money supply. It was independent by design, insulated from the political pressures that the Treasury Department answers to. What happened this week is not the end of the Federal Reserve. The Fed still sets the overnight rate, and that matters. But everything else, the digital dollar, the debt buybacks, the bank charters, the enforcement actions, the sanctions, the stablecoin rules, the financial architecture of the next 50 years, is being built by Treasury. One department, one secretary, reporting to one president. That'd be a good thumbnail too. Okay, now, what else did I have here? Oh yes, this in the replies to that last one. This one came up from Joe Lange. I don't know exactly how it's how it's pronounced, but I've read him here quite a bit. He said Trump took control of the Fed in his first term and rolled them into the Treasury. I wrote about that in an article years ago. I don't think people are contemplating the other possibility. BlackRock was a part of that deal. But what if Larry Fink took a deal? What if BlackRock, along with other Wall Street players, have already been captured? What if they're playing a role in this war that nobody's expecting? For years, I've heard people complaining about BlackRock buying up everything. They've been painted as the enemy and stealing all the assets. But what if they're doing it under orders by Trump? What if Trump is using them to buy a lot of assets in order to make the transition into the new financial system a lot easier and quicker when the central bank system goes bankrupt? This has been a thought in the back of my mind for years. Is it a possibility? I actually think a lot of corporations that were on the side of the enemy have been captured and are being used to win this war. Tech companies too, and any other corporation that involves national security. Just a thought. This was from December 30th, 2024. And Yahoo Finance article said, in other words, the federal government is nationalizing large swaths of the financial markets. The Fed is providing the money to do it. BlackRock will be doing the trades. This scheme essentially merges the Fed and Treasury into one organization. So, meet your new Fed chairman, Donald J. Trump. What do they mean by this? Now, POTUS and Congress delivered the Genius Act, establishing a landmark framework and clear rules of the road for payment stablecoins, and Treasury is moving quickly to implement that framework. This is a tweet from Scott Bessent on August 17th. Treasury welcomes input from stakeholders who work to provide the regulatory certainty businesses need to innovate and grow in America, cement the role of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, and keep America the crypto capital of the world. And here we have some commentary from my fellow Luong-gooners will recognize this woman, Caitlin Long.
Just this week, we got an incredible announcement that I think a lot of folks did not fully grasp, but I was talking to someone who just left the Treasury Department, and he confirmed it, which is that Treasury put out Genius Act regulations on the recognition of non-U.S. issued stablecoins. What does that mean? It means the Treasury Department is taking charge of what is allowed to be a so-called euro dollar, euro yen, euro yuan, right? And for those of us who are financial markets people, we know that the term euro does not mean European. It means a dollar issued offshore outside of the United States is called a euro dollar. A euro is a euro issued outside of the Eurozone, right? So basically these are tokenized fiat currencies issued outside of their home country. And the US Treasury is taking charge of the recognition of the validity of these. That is massive. If you're a student of the financial markets, you know that the Eurodollar market is as large as the domestic financial market. That's the offshore dollar market. So when the US Treasury is taking control of what is recognized as valid, that is taken from the Fed. So what's really going on here is with the tokenization movement, the Treasury is taking power back over the US dollar, over the Eurodollar markets, and frankly, over the US role in the financial system globally from the Fed. And to put that into context, when we were talking earlier about how antiquated the traditional system is, and that the Fed systems are themselves behind, and part of the challenge with the Genius Act, if you've been watching, all of the other agencies have issued rules, one glaring exception, the Fed has not issued its rules yet. And according to the Genius Act, all of the agency's rules were supposed to be final a couple of weeks ago. The Fed hasn't even issued theirs yet. So there's this dynamic going on between the Treasury Department and the Fed, and that is really important because Scott Bessent is a big believer in tokenization, and he is pushing, with the Trump administration, the system towards tokenization. That is massive. That is not going to be reversible even if the Republicans lose the next presidential election. And it's going to mean that the Treasury Department is really going to be at the center of financial markets, which is historically what it had been. It's just only in the last couple of decades that it was really the Fed, but that pendulum is swinging hard towards Treasury, and that's really meaningful. However, it also means a lot more volatility. I know we're going to hear from OCC Comptroller Gould, and Jeff, you were talking about the durability of Wyoming's chartering authority. Both of us have chosen to stay in the state system. Part of the risk that those who go with the national chartering from the OCC, which is what most in this industry have done, is that pendulum could swing pretty hard. So we will see more volatility, but I'm excited about Treasury taking all of that control back because we are now going to be a much more tech-forward financial market.
So that was Caitlin Long. She is a she used to have a Bitcoin company. I can't remember if she still does, but she's let me just pull up her whole bio. She's been on with Tom Luongo multiple times. Had some very, very good conversations. So yeah, Wyoming blockchain advocate is how she describes herself. Founder and CEO at Custodia Bank. She was a 22-year Wall Street veteran who's been active in Bitcoin and blockchain since 2012. And then she started Custodia Bank, or she was involved in the beginning of it. She also worked at Morgan Stanley and Credit Suisse for a while. So big Bitcoin advocate. So the Genius Act is, as Ben Shapiro on 2X, was it Ben Shapiro? Yeah. He says, I see far too few people who get the joke in the name of that act. It's the Genius Act for stablecoins because Trump is a very stable genius. Yes, that's exactly what it is. There was another competing act called the Stable Act as well. So there was a Stable Act and the Genius Act, which were the two that, so the purpose of the Genius Act is to establish the legal legitimacy of the stablecoin market. It's defining what a stablecoin is, what the rules are for stablecoin issuers, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have the Clarity Act. So there's the Genius Act, which has already been passed, already been made law. Then you have the Clarity Act, which is for market structure. So it tells you like what is it, defines what a stablecoin is as distinct from a cryptocurrency that's treated as a commodity versus one that's treated as a security. So it's the market structure delineating this is what each of these different digital assets is going to be treated as legally, and will give the clarity to the market so that they can begin incorporating this, the larger institutions and stuff can begin incorporating it into their various business models. Because for right now, one of the biggest things that's holding it back is the lack of regulatory clarity. The previous administration refused to provide any clarity. They just said the clarity that you'll get is when you get subpoenaed by Congress, or you get a knock on the door from the Department of Justice. All right, so then there's this here real quick. Speaking of the Genius Act, Trump said this week.
What it's done, it's been amazing. 1 year ago this summer, I signed landmark legislation known as the Genius Act. I named it after myself. I didn't want to use my name, so I just called it the Genius Act.
My president. Now, I got a quick article here to read, and then we get to the feature presentation, the Scott Bessent interview. So Alex Craner says, blast from the past, the Genius Act will lead to the collapse of the Eurodollar system, which is bigger than the U.S. domestic dollar system. It'll also collapse the rules-based global order as is, the imminent fall of the Eurodollar system. During a meeting with technology, crypto, and finance leaders held at the White House yesterday, President Trump brought up the Genius Act again. Genius, by the way, stands for Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stablecoins. Trump framed the act as part of his administration's broader crypto and digital asset agenda, ending what he called the war on crypto, launching Project Crypto, establishing a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve, and creating a digital asset stockpile. He said, 1 year ago this summer, I signed landmark legislation known as the Genius Act, paving the way for widespread adoption of dollar-backed stablecoins, and that's worked out very well. Indeed, the act was already passed last summer, and Trump signed it into law on 18 July 2025, so why all the commotion about it now, more than a year later? Could be earth-shattering. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tweeted that the Genius Act established a landmark framework and clear rules of the road for payment stablecoins, and that the Treasury is moving quickly to implement that framework, asking for input from stakeholders in order to cement the role of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency and keep America the crypto capital of the world. The act defines new U.S. federal laws creating a comprehensive regulatory framework for payment stablecoins redeemable for a fixed monetary value, typically $1, and intended to maintain a stable value relative to the legal tender currency. It also restricts the usage of stablecoins to permitted payment stablecoin issuers, and this is where the Genius Act gets extremely interesting. Speaking at the SALT conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the former Wall Street executive and prominent advocate for monetary reform, Caitlin Long, pointed out that the Genius Act enables the Treasury Department to define, quote, what is allowed to be a so-called Eurodollar, Euro-yen, or Euro-euro, or yuan, right? She continued, the term euro doesn't mean European. It means a dollar issued offshore outside of the United States. These are tokenized fiat currencies issued outside of their home country, and the US Treasury is taking charge of the recognition of the validity of these. That is massive. The fact that there are institutions outside of the United States that can issue US currency should be regarded as an illegal aberration. Effectively, they're counterfeiting US dollars, but in spite of that, for some reason, it's been taken as normal for decades now. That's in spite of the fact that counterfeiting US dollars abroad effectively robs the purchasing power American taxpayers have to fund any manner of nefarious activities. It robs the purchasing power of American taxpayers to fund any manner of nefarious activities. Most likely, that's why this system was allowed to grow to such massive proportions. Caitlin Long again. If you're a student of the financial markets, you know that the Eurodollar market is as large as the domestic financial market. That's the offshore dollar market. When the US Treasury is taking control of what is recognized as valid, that is taken from the Fed. The Treasury is taking power back over the US dollar, over the Eurodollar markets, and frankly, over the US role in the financial system globally from the Fed. Every time I see "and frankly," I always read it in my head, "and frankly." Long made these comments after discussing the Genius Act with, quote, someone who just walked out of a Treasury Department meeting. And if she is right, I believe she certainly is, the implications could be truly earth-shattering. To begin with, disenfranchising the Fed and taking control over the currency from them is the stuff of civil wars. To put that into context, when we were talking earlier about how antiquated the traditional system is, this is quoting from Caitlin Long again, and that the Fed systems are themselves behind, if you've been watching, all of the other agencies have issued rules in accordance to the Genius Act. One glaring exception, the Fed has not issued its rules yet, and according to the Genius Act, all of the agency's rules were supposed to be final a couple of weeks ago. The Fed hasn't even issued theirs yet, so there's this dynamic going on between the Treasury Department and the Fed. Back to Craner. The dynamic going on between the Treasury Department and the Fed is a political collision course where the Treasury is trying to wrest the control over the monetary system from the unelected private bankers to the democratically elected government and its legitimate institutions. I know, the idea that the Trump administration is doing anything legitimate may defy imagination by now, but the current arrangement is anything but legitimate. Alex is unfortunately very black-pilled about the Iran war, but he's a good dude. It's also patently unconstitutional. The Constitution of the U.S. explicitly authorizes the Congress with the power, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof. The Constitution also gives Congress the power, quote, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Eurodollar, Fed, and the shadow governments. The counterfeit U.S. dollars circulating abroad are the glue that holds the global rules-based order together. They enable the funding needed to bribe foreign officials, pay for and arm the sundry jihadi terror groups and separatist militias, the colossal network of NGOs, charitable organizations, and other groups and activities of the shadow governments around the world can't be fully funded through legitimate legal means. These activities often require illegal activities and trillions in embezzled funds. For example, according to recent reports, billions of dollars have been offered to Iranian officials to sell out and turn Iran over to a government more friendly to the Trump team. In the past, we know that hundreds of millions in U.S. banknotes are routinely smuggled from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York past the U.S. comptroller of the currency to provide funding for coups, assassinations, regime change operations, and similar special assignments by the shadow government. This is why it should be essential for the U.S. government to regain control of the dollars circulating abroad, or to render those dollars illegitimate and worthless. So there's two approaches there. On one hand, you could try to regain control of the offshore dollars, or you could just render those offshore dollars illegitimate and worthless. If they were issued on the basis of fraud or are tied to terrorism or anything like that, these become pretexts for actually just eliminating them. This would defund the rules-based global order and reassert U.S. economic and financial sovereignty. While it would be too optimistic to expect that the Trump administration have pushed the Genius Act to achieve any such elevated goals, we should hope that they might leave behind the means needed for the American democracy to reassert its economic and financial sovereignty and turn its currency into a tool to recover its prosperity and economic edge. Given that half or more of all U.S. dollars in circulation around the world are outside the United States, the administration's intended actions, there'll be ambushes, we'll find out, will cause major tremors in world markets, driving demand for legitimate dollars and rendering the illegitimate ones worthless. You see this? You see the structure that's being set up here. The Treasury is asserting control over the Fed in defining and maintaining what currency units are considered legitimate and not, for pursuing fraud. And as the world moves more and more in a stablecoin direction, than like being the institution that's out in front of defining what a US dollar stablecoin is and enforcing US dollar stablecoin policy effectively becomes the predominant currency role. And so then, the Treasury asserts this power over the Fed, pushes the Fed into the corner, and then you create the pretext whereby people come demanding legitimate dollars, and you flush out the illegitimate ones. This will enable Trump and his team to exert pressure on governments around the world and dictate terms at which their dollar balances may be converted into new stablecoins needed for trade settlement and reserve requirements. You see it. So when these foreign governments sell their treasuries and the Treasury buys it back, they're also establishing currency agreements with them or trade deals whereby they will take their dollar balances and convert them into new stablecoins. I expect that Great Britain, EU, and Canada won't be among the most favored nations in the near future, which will further worsen their fiscal positions, make it difficult for them to access global markets and procure commodities like oil, natural gas, wheat, and others. This will lead to shortages and exacerbate inflationary pressures at home. And then he has his main market report and market analysis services that you can subscribe to. All right, now, all of that said, let us now turn to this interview published, what was the date? October 26, 2023, on the Money Maze podcast. Get this tightened up here just a little bit. Who is Scott Bessent? Meet Trump's new U.S. Treasury Secretary. Now, that wasn't the original title of the video. He went back in and changed the title after Bessent became the Treasury Secretary, optimizing his SEO. So who is Scott Bessent? Meet Trump's new U.S. Treasury Secretary. This was from October 26, 2023. And let me speed it up a wee. Let's go.
If you were a key player on the George Soros team that in 1992 helped the Quantum Fund make $1 billion shorting the pound ahead of the UK's withdrawal from the ERM, are acknowledged as a significant thinker, a highly respected macro hedge fund manager, have taught financial history as an adjunct professor at Yale, and a recognised philanthropist, you might know that our guest today is Scott Bessent. Scott's firm, Key Square, has as his firm's mantra, we study history, we observe the present, and try to imagine the future. And that's what I hope we all do today.
We'll come back to the name of his firm here in a little bit, Key Square Management.
So Scott, you're over from the US, we're recording here in London, and I have a list of macro market topics I'm itching to ask, and our listeners will be reaching to hear. So welcome to the Money Maze podcast.
Good. Thanks, Simon. And I think our compliance department wants to say this is all my opinion, not investment advice for your viewing, listening audience. So I'm looking forward to this.
Great. Well, there's been a lot of press around Elon Musk's father's influence on his career. And you told me that your father had one of the largest collections of science fiction books in your part of the US and used to sit and discuss them when you were a child. So much so you said that you could point out the Alpha Centauri constellation before you knew where Chicago was. Now, how did that make you perceive the world?
Yeah, it was incredible. So the largest science fiction collection in South Carolina, not a high bar, but my dad loved to talk about it. And we would sit, look at the stars, try to imagine things. Are there people on other planets? If you could believe it, one of our neighbors had a proper observatory telescope. So it's just this imagination that there could be something different. And it could be on a different planet, or it could be, in macro investing, it's kind of regime change, which is, I think, why I gravitated to it. You need a good imagination.
Well, we're going to talk about some of those skills required for your specific part of the business. But you also said your father was a boom-bust real estate investor and his roller coaster fortunes made you focused on risk management. Watching furniture being carried out of a house that your family has owned for 200 years will focus one's mind on not blowing up. Now, of course, some folks would bet that against such a mercurial backdrop, you would be a risk-averse academic or you would avoid investments. But of course, that hasn't been the case, and we're going to unpick that. But how did you earn your first dollar?
Well,
now, what's interesting is note as he's talking about some of his early biography, there'll be another note here we'll come to in a minute, but as he's talking about his early biography, note how much risk tolerance he has. It's kind of this theme that you'll hear behind this, is that he has an extraordinary tolerance for risk compared to the average person, and he thinks about risk very strategically and self-consciously, which I think it was Jeff last night in the voice chat. He pointed out this makes it all the more striking that he says Trump's risk tolerance is too much even for Bessent, that he's like, I have no idea how the guy does it.
Well, I earned my first dollar putting out the chairs on the beach for lifeguards and hoping one day to be a lifeguard. But, I would say, I think I mentioned to you, I'm a competitive backgammon player. So in backgammon, there's with the doubling dice, there's something called PRAT, the P-R-A-T, and it stands for positioning, racing, and threat. So do you double? If you have 2 out of the 3, you double. So I tend to be more focused on the threat.
Right.
Okay, now, one of the first places that we'll stop here. Real quick, I've got to update something here from Lurch. Sent some magical internet money for your boy. Thank you, sir. $47. Add that to the goal. We are almost halfway to the goal, folks. Please do tip your streamer. Be like Lurch. And that reminds me, I need to get you my wallet details so you can send different types of magical internet money to me. I will get on that here later tonight. I am enjoying my the current state of my digital asset portfolio right now. It has been a fun little ride the last few days. Okay, so I don't know anything about backgammon. Have never played backgammon. I've heard of it. I've been aware of it. I've never played it. I have no idea how it's played. But he said this. He brings this up. He said there's these 3 different components: position, race, and threats, and that he is a threats first player. And I thought, okay, well, you can learn a lot about the sort of guys like Scott Bessent. The way that these guys choose to play games, their strategies for backgammon or for chess or for poker, these are all different games that their personalities will be expressed. And you can actually kind of learn something about this based on the strategies that they use in the games they play. Ozzy Steen!
Nothing beats spending a Saturday night with the Patriots watching 2 Metros talking about economics in a posh British apartment.
So true. So true. Don't you enjoy it, boys? Just going to sit here and watch a couple of posh fellows. Thank you, Ozzy Steen. $100, man.
Boner alert.
A shekel for a good guy.
I've kind of let the soundboard. I haven't used it enough lately. I've kind of let it go to waste. Need to make sure I do that a little more often.
We need to take those motherfuckers out.
That's what Scott Bessent says. Also, make sure you go to forum.kingpill.com. If we do hit the goal today, we still got a little ways to go, but if we do hit the goal today, then we will do a drawing. So go sign up at forum.kingpill.com. No purchase necessary. Just give me something to call you and a way to contact you, and your name will be considered when I do the drawing if we hit that goal. Okay, so when I heard this, I immediately paused, and I went over to the Grockler. And I said, Scott Bessent described himself as a backgammon player who is, in the Pratt frame, most focused on threat. Apply this insight about the way he views the world. Straight buster!
Couple Bush lattes down the hatch. Pay the man, folks.
Oh, Patriot hours. Consuming some Bush lattes? This is real Patriot behavior. I said, apply this insight about the way he views the world and acts strategically to what we've discussed in the past about his desire to remake the global dollar system along with Trump. This is what the Grockler says. Bessent treats the dollar system the way a threat-first backgammon player treats the board. He does not wait for a clean race or a perfectly built position. He looks for the blot, the hit, the point that forces the opponent to decide under pressure. Now, I don't understand what those things, blot and hit and point, I don't understand what these are in backgammon. If you know how to play, congratulations, you understand more of this than I do. Pratt is the backgammon heuristic for cube decisions. Position which is structure and flexibility, race, which is pip count / raw progress, and threats, immediate hitting, priming, or gammon potential. Again, I don't understand any of these things, but I understand what comes next. A player who weights threat highest plays the game as a series of forcing moves rather than a marathon or a slow build-out. He accepts luck, the dice, and the hand he is dealt, then uses whatever is on the board to create or neutralize danger right now. That is how Bessent described his own style, and it maps directly onto how he and Trump have approached the post-war dollar order. Now, I've primed Grok with this. I've had enough conversations like this that it naturally wants to feed me my worldview, so I just remain aware of that, and just keep that in mind as I'm seeing what it spits out for me. The old system was an open, relatively forgiving position. The United States provided the reserve currency, deep markets, and security umbrella, while others ran persistent surpluses, used the dollar, and sometimes evaded its rules. Bessent's public remarks treat that as a board that has been exploited. The threats he sees are concrete. China's opaque currency practices and alternative payment rails, Iran and others selling oil outside the dollar, potential large-scale treasury sales by Japan or Gulf holders if yields spike, and the gradual erosion of reserve share. He does not treat these as background noise or as problems that 3% growth alone will solve. He treats them as blots that must be hit or as points that must be made before the opponent can escape. That produces a specific style of remake, rather than a grand simultaneous Bretton Woods reset. The Mar-a-Lago Accord talk was always more threat-based than architectural. Tariffs function like a double. They force the other side to take or drop, and the terms of any deal can lock in longer-dated dollar funding or reciprocal access. So the tariffs are like a forcing function here that both induce behavior out of the other party, and so they're either going to escalate and then you deal with the escalation when the escalation happens, or they come to the table as a consequence of the tariffs, and then you negotiate out a deal that works for both sides. Swap line discussions with the UAE, Japan, and others are the equivalent of establishing a new point that both contains the threat, disorderly sales or RMB invoicing, and extends the home board. Yen intervention and stepped-up treasury buybacks are defensive hits against an immediate threat, a funding shock that would raise U.S. rates and weaken the very reserve status he wants to preserve. The Genius Act and dollar-backed stablecoins occupy the digital space so that the next generation of payments does not become an escape route. So the United States has to, it is an absolute obligation, given the United States' position within the world, that for the United States' own sake, the United States needs to dictate what the next generation of payments is going to look like. Otherwise, whoever does that creates the escape route that everyone else can use. Sanctions and economic shield language are the same logic applied to Iran and illicit finance. Make the cost of leaving or cheating the system high enough that most players stay. A race-first player, I know many race-first players, a race-first player would have prioritized the 3-3-3 targets, growth, deficit, and energy, and waited for the numbers to improve the pip count. A position-first player would have focused on institutions, predictability, and restoring the old open architecture. Bessent's pattern is to use events, the Iran conflict, yen weakness, and tariff deadlines, as the dice that let him act on threats immediately, then convert those actions into a slightly different board. Still dollar-centered, but less automatic, more explicitly tied to security and reciprocity, and harder for adversaries or free riders to exploit. The dollar is not being abandoned, it's being used as the instrument that forces the reordering. That's a sentence right there. The dollar is not being abandoned, it's being used as the instrument that forces the reordering. This is why his interventions look tactical and sometimes contradictory from the outside. For example, strong dollar rhetoric plus buybacks that can weaken it, or support for allies plus coercive tariffs. In backgammon terms, he's not trying to win a fair race on the current position, he's trying to generate enough threat that the other side has to accept a new cube or a new set of points. The global dollar system is being remade the same way, incrementally, under pressure, and with the threat of exclusion or pain as the main lever. And if you have been listening to the Astrolabe for long enough now, you would know that we have been on his schemes for a while now. We have the red, yellow, green framework tying market access and access to the U.S. security umbrella with cooperating with the changes.
If you have 2 out of the 3, you double. So I tend to be more focused on the threat.
Right, and that is absolutely what we're going to talk about a little bit in detail. But you choose Yale. I'm always intrigued. We've had lots of people from lots of different backgrounds. Why Yale?
I think I wanted to get out of the South. It was a medium-sized city in New Haven, near New York, but not New York, and a great reputation. Yale had the host of distinguished alumni from South Carolina.
He wanted to be near New York, but not in New York.
Before the Civil War, Charleston had the second or third most students at Yale. So there's a big South Carolina tradition. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. Do I want to be a journalist? Do I want to be a computer?
I notice, too, a theme here is, number one, an appreciation for tradition and a deep identification with the state that he grew up in, identifying himself as a South Carolinian. Or is it Carolinian or Carolinian? South Carolinian? South Carolinian. What do you folks, those of you who are in that area who've talked to those people, what do they say?
Charleston had the second or third most students at Yale. So there's a big South Carolina tradition. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. Do I want to be a journalist? Do I want to be a computer scientist? And keep in mind, this was 1980, that the computer science department had just switched over from cards, which I think probably the 80% of the people being part of this, they can't imagine, and to the mainframes. So, I was back and forth between quantitative and qualitative, and Yale was a good mix.
Right. Now, I understand that you actually did get your first job as a securities analyst for the investment firm of a Saudi Arabian family.
Right. So,
now, isn't that interesting? That was something I hadn't known before. Something about his biography that I've studied quite a few times, but I somehow missed that he worked as a securities analyst for a Saudi Arabian royal family.
My first job was actually with George Soros's old partner, Jim Rogers. It was a summer internship. He had, when I look back at it, I'm not even sure you could put this on a bulletin board now, but it was analysts wanted, do spreadsheets, make lunch, and you can sleep on the sofa if you don't have a place to live. And I didn't have a place to live. So you can imagine 107th and Broadway in 1982 in New York City was quite spicy, but it was an incredible experience. Jim is one of the great researchers,
Okay, so this was another thing. I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't realize that he slept on Jim Rogers' sofa living in the Upper West Side in the 80s. I was like, well, I don't know New York well enough to know what Upper West Side in the 80s means directly. I kind of have a bit of a sense, but so I went back over to the Clanker and I said, what would the Upper West Side of New York around 107th and Broadway have been like in the early to mid 1980s? Answer: gritty, transitional, and a mix of old working class New York with emerging gentrification pressures. That's the short version. It sat on the northern edge of the neighborhood, often treated as the Upper West Side, or part of Manhattan Valley and Bloomingdale, just south of Morningside Heights and Columbia University. Broadway here was the commercial spine with the one train nearby, and a small park at the intersection where Broadway meets West End Avenue. The area felt more like a frontier than the more established parts of the Upper West Side further south. This was peak high-crime New York City before the later drop. The 24th Precinct, covering 86th to 110th, dealt with the usual citywide issues plus local ones. West 107th Street itself, especially the block between Manhattan and Amsterdam Avenues just east of Broadway, so this is like 3 blocks from where he was staying, became a notorious open-air drug market by the mid-'80s. Dealers operated openly. Crack, which hit hard around 1984 and 85, was sold in doorways and on sidewalks. Empty vials littered the street, and there was gunplay and intimidation. It was called a symbol of what was wrong on the Upper West Side. Buyers included local students and even some professionals driving through. A major 1987 raid swept the block, but the problems had been building for years. Side streets and some buildings felt sketchy at night. Graffiti was common, as were the general signs of 1980s urban decay. Neglected properties, some SRO hotels, and the city's broader homelessness and fiscal hangover. So the gentrification in the area started by like the late 80s. So there was literally a big open air drug market a couple of blocks away from where he was living, which is the man has experienced many, many very interesting things. Came from South Carolina, went to Yale, but also lived in the Upper West Side right next to a huge open air drug market. Then worked for the Saudi Arabian royal family, spent a bunch of time in Japan. He's had a very fascinating life. Thank you, Ozzystein, For the 5 gifted subs, Lurch, Viva Cristo Ray, Blaine Morgan, Florida Girl, and Hyperbarian. 5 Patriots. 5 for 5. Thank you, Ozzy.
Research. And I could see how he and George Soros were this incredible pair with Jim's research and then George's market instincts. It was the incredible combination.
Do you go and work as a securities analyst after that?
Yes. So I did a training program at Brown Brothers. And then I went to work for this Saudi family. And again, counterintuitive, but South Carolina and Saudi Arabia had a long history. Governor of South Carolina had been U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So, and this family is incredible. They're one of the most prominent families still. The father came, I think, to the U.S. in the early 60s, saw New York, and used, unlike sort of most Saudis of his day, he didn't want to meet movie stars. He didn't want to do this. He wanted to meet CEOs. And he was generating this incredible cash flow from servicing all the Aramco employees. And he just kept reinvesting it into U.S. companies. And he got right in at the bottom, 1975, and had the ride of a lifetime. And, they are the most understated, the hardworking Middle Eastern family. I'm still very close to them. And the next generation's taking over. And
I'm still very close to them, he said in October of 2023. And you'll notice that a number of times he says this, like he'll say a thing and he kind of is like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm still very close to them. Kind of nods, like, right? You catch what I'm laying down?
And it's incredible to watch the work ethic.
So you end up running, when you go back to work with George Soros, you run the London office for 8 years. You work with Stan Druckenmiller, and we'll talk a little bit about mentors later on. And you obviously had some very high profile successes. And then you set up your own firm, Key Square. And that's when we're going to start talking about the markets. But just a bit of reference for our listener community. Some will be very familiar with global macro, some less. But if you were to describe global macro at its very essence, how would you describe it?
You are observing the world, you're observing markets, you're observing what you think should happen, and you're observing what is happening. And it's good and bad that you can look around the world and you're looking for mispricings. You are looking for policy errors. You're looking for political changes. So basically, you are looking for change on the margin, and you want to see what the market is giving you.
So his whole investment strategy is built around the notion of viewing global finance through the lens of geopolitics, and specifically looking for what he says mispricings and policy errors. This was the basis for his whole investment career. This is the world that he's lived in for his entire life, and now he's the Treasury Secretary of an activist treasury that is asserting a new role in the global financial system.
What is the market giving you? What's the opportunity set? Because you might think you have a great idea. You might think you split an atom, and then it turns out everyone else believes it. But look, the interesting, a good example would be October 2016. I didn't think Donald Trump was going to win, but I thought he could win. No one else thought he could win. I actually had a big bet with one of my neighbors in the Bahamas, who's quite a prominent currency speculator on that.
There's another one. Interesting. He's going to mention the Bahamas again, but so he has a neighbor in the Bahamas who is a very wealthy currency speculator. Where are my Luangooners at? What do you think of when you think of currency speculators or, adjacent sorts of figures in the Caribbean?
Got it. So you launched Key Square. It was one of the largest hedge fund launches ever. I think George Soros was a $2 billion anchor investor, and I think you had sort of $4.5 billion, within 6 months. Key Square, I have learned, as I have done my research, is from a chess sequence. I'm not a chess player. I'm not a backgammon player. But you say that it doesn't take long for a beginner of chess to learn that the end game is the most difficult and complicated part of the game, despite there being less pieces on the board. So help the
Yes, Lurch, City of London. There's the connections with, he mentioned something with crypto later on too regarding the Bahamas, but what he has, whether or not he views the world through that City of London framework, he has a pretty personal, deep understanding of the the offshore dollar market and how it functions and the way that crypto ties into that, how the currency speculators operate, how that entire derivative platform exists and behaves. This is something that he's got personal experience with. It turns out, like, everything that I learn about him, I'm like, man, this is the perfect possible person to have as a Treasury Secretary. I could give a shit that he's gay.
The non-chess players in the audience here understand, you would have given a lot of thought to that name. Why?
Sure. So a lot of what we do, back to your question on what is global macro, that you can have these big trends and you can either be part of the trend, you can ride the momentum. George Soros's theory of reflexivity is really a momentum strategy. If it's going up, buy it. If it's really going up, buy more. And at the turn is when you can really make a lot of money. So with Key Square.
So George Soros's theory of reflexivity is basically that it's as I understand it, it's basically like the markets are alive. They're like live, spontaneous, not spontaneously, but they're networks of emergent phenomena that are all interrelated, and so they're updating themselves in real time, for better or for worse, based on the actions that individual market participants are making. So it's like a contrast to the efficient markets hypothesis, where it's basically like detaching yourself from the market and viewing it as the behavior of irrational beings that are they have their own biases and their own perceptions, their own frames of reference that they're using to engage in the market. And you don't just assume that the market's always going to balance itself out, but it actually there's a big boom and bust cycle that's inherent to it because of the like bad decisions that individual market actors make.
It's when there are just two kings, several pawns, and there is one square you can move to, and you win. So, if you think about the financial markets, many times there is one investment you can do, and you win. So whether it's John Paulson with the CDO, CDS in 2008, whether it's Stan Druckenmiller shorting the pound, it's kind of again and again, you see these things, and it's, we try to keep things very simple.
I appreciate that he always refers to it as Stan Druckenmiller shorting the pound. Because it was Stan Druckenmiller was acting on the research and the insight that the young 29-year-old Scott Bessent brought to him. It was Scott Bessent's bet, but it was he brought it to his superior, and his superior took it to his superior or his partner, and that was the basis for the bet. But this was Scott Bessent's operation.
Is we have few positions, and where are we going to, and what is the key square?
So you're continually looking for that position that will enable you to win with the least risk. We have information overload. How do you separate noise from signal?
So I actually don't have a Bloomberg. The former mayor, doesn't like for me to say this in interviews, that I have an incredible trading desk is, for me, watching, there's no information value in watching things turn yellow or red constantly. We have a lot of respect for the markets. I look at 270 charts every night. We're not a think tank.
So we're not a think tank. In other words, we're not just here like huffing our own farts. We actually have our strategy. We have our skin in the game, and we're definitely very tuned into the market. He's like, if everybody else is on a Bloomberg, then I actually don't want to be on a Bloomberg, because I want to be able to sit outside the Bloomberg hive mind and capitalize on mistakes that they make.
You're just looking for either things that are changing, anomalies, or what you think is clearly a mistake, or that's something that's maybe unsustainable, and then you identify why now. Is that unsustainability going to break?
So as we think about, and the industry likes to talk about micro and macro, you have written, we don't have an edge in predicting non-farm payrolls, but you can learn a lot from what corporates are saying about wages, hiring, and capex. And the cynic would say, well, so can everyone. So what is it that you think you do or use with that information that gives you an advantage?
So I think what's different is, if I look at the good one of the few good things about being 61 is I have a lot of data. So I've been doing this a long time. And if I look back, in terms of asset classes, foreign exchange has been our biggest dollar winner since I started doing macro in 92, followed by equities. And I think that when we're talking to a company, we aren't necessarily trying to get an edge on.
So in other words, he says foreign exchange is like their biggest thing. Next is equities, but foreign exchange has been their biggest winner. In other words, the water that he swims in, his domain is currency relationships. That's the thing that he's like far and above everything else. And then equities along with that. So if the dude, carry trades, swap lines, like the relationship between the currencies, which gets very meta, very abstract. That's the domain that, like, you have to have a high enough IQ just to even begin to enter the domain. And to be a master of the domain, you got to have some horsepower under the hood.
Edge on the company, we're trying to get an edge on the economy. So that, everyone's trying to predict the Microsoft talking to a company, we aren't necessarily followed by equities. And I think that when we're talking to a company, we aren't necessarily trying to get an edge on the company, we're trying to get an edge on the economy. So that, everyone's trying to predict the Microsoft earnings, or everyone's trying to figure out the FedEx earnings. I'm trying to figure out what is the FedEx wage round, or what is the UPS wage round? If it bleeds into a FedEx wage round, then tell me about a wage price spiral in the U.S. So it's the same information. We just have a different use case.
So in other words, he's taking a holistic view of, like, not just the silo of the individual company and its individual performance, but how does it fit within all of the other companies like it, or then take the industry of companies like it, how do they fit next to other industries that have their own set of companies that are like each other, and what happens if they start interfacing with each other? How do these different players in the market affect one another, when the way that this company affects this company will also determine how this company affects this company? So it's a very abstracted, holistic view of the financial system. And this is, Soros has his the philanthropic activist side, and then he has his investment side. On his investment side, Soros is brilliant, genuinely brilliant investor, or at least he was able to accumulate a team of brilliant investors and create a culture, an ecosystem where they could perform very well. But then the philanthropic activist side of it was a separate operation.
So this comes back to your earlier point about macro investors almost need to have a flexible imagination.
Sure. It is, we're on a podcast, but it is, these didn't exist three to 5 years ago. When you think about the, how many jobs there are that didn't exist, we were just talking about what will our sons do, is job probably doesn't exist, but you just got to train them well for how it does exist.
I remember a great macro thinker, David Roach, Morgan Stanley's strategist, coming in after the Berlin Wall had fallen, and the consensus was, rates rise, this is awful. And he was unequivocal, you just go and buy German equities. It was that, he saw the unification beyond the rising cost of capital. And of course, it was, for a while, that absolute home run trade. We might talk about Germany's, more troubled situation later on. Let's talk about, did you want to?
Oh, no. And again, things are counterintuitive, right? Like, you just said it was a home run trade, and then it was a terrible trade. Right, because that there was the impetus, or the shock, the demand shock from rebuilding the East, and the US-mark and the D-mark coming at parity, which no one could believe. So that's a shock.
He's talking about East Germany, like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and and then like beginning to integrate the German economy. And they had the exchange rate mechanism, and it was a bet. I can't remember the exact structure of it, but it was a bet against using something with the exchange rate mechanism and the British pound and mortgage rates that were free floating. And they realized that essentially they could crash the British pound by betting this arbitrage, or it was something to that effect. And that it was built off the back of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the normalization and unification of the German economy.
Probably a policy mistake that led to a great deal of inflation. And then the Bundesbank pulled back the liquidity. Right? And then, that set off a chain reaction, collapse in European equities, which is actually how I ended up in the Soros London office. The Bundesbank actually put me here.
Okay, explain that. Just a little vignette.
The then manager had a very large position in what you would call a reunification play, which worked well for a bit. Then when the Bundesbank decided, we're the Bundesbank, we don't like inflation, and they started hiking rates aggressively, the shares collapsed. So there was a management change in London. So, so it's always...
Okay, so it was a policy move by the Bank of London based on a misapprehension of how the Bundesbank was going to react to changing market conditions. So essentially, the Bank of London had bet that the Bundesbank was not going to tighten things up if inflation started taking off. And so what they did is they just made inflation start taking off and shorted the currency. So they they played both sides of it and locked the Bank of London in a corner. And then he said there was a management change. someone got taken out back and shot.
Sequencing is very important in macro. Sequencing is...
there's a nugget. There's one. If you're collecting Scott Bessent's nuggets, there's one of them. Sequencing is very important in macro.
Right now, and maybe we'll talk about it later, is there's clearly a slow motion de-dollarization going on. But could the initial stages be a dollar rally because countries are paying back their dollar debt? So
right there, that's the dollar milkshake theory. Shout out Brent Johnson. What he's saying right here, there is a slow motion de-dollarization happening. But as people are going through this de-dollarization process, what's actually going to happen is they have to pay all of their dollar-denominated debts. So you're actually going to have an interregnum where you have a re-dollarization, where all of a sudden the dollar really strengthens. Because in order to get yourself off the dollar system, you have to invest deeper into the dollar system. So what he's between the lines, what he's saying here is, if you understand that there's a de-dollarization happening, you can actually Uno reverse that. If you were, say, I don't know, the Treasury Secretary, you might be able to capitalize on the recognition that in order for people to de-dollarize, they're going to have to pay off their dollar-denominated debts, which means they're going to need dollars. So in order for countries, banks, companies, whatever, to de-dollarize, they have to first flood into the dollar, which is going to strengthen the dollar. And so if you capitalize on this right, you can actually prevent them from de-dollarizing by recognizing the sequencing of this here.
So there's a dollar thirst before there's a dollar boycott.
Well, you can't see
a dollar thirst before a dollar boycott. That is, if you've ever wondered what the dollar milkshake theory is, that is it right there. What Brent Johnson identified is that in order for people to de-dollarize, they're going to first have to flood into dollars. So if you're talking about a dollar collapse, the only way for the dollar to collapse is if everyone else has already collapsed.
See my sheet of questions, but as we move to investment themes, number one is de-dollarization. So you already jumped in there. So how do you think about taking that idea, which I guess many people would say isn't controversial, that the dollar loses not its hegemony, its relative status? How do you think about the journey ahead, and how do you think about, as an investor, when is the right time to build your positions?
Again, we look for stress in the system. We just did a 3-day offsite here in London, and I came away thinking we had these kind of meta long arc ideas, and the challenge here is, as you just said, where to implement them as actionable market ideas. You see things happening on the margin. This Shanghai Gold Exchange, very interesting. We see India and China being able to pay for oil, which is the ultimate dollar, the commodity, and
so he sees he has, as part of his framework, is that oil is the ultimate dollar commodity, at least as of October of 2023.
Rupees and RMB. So you've now moved the U.S. out of the way. So, and I'll tell you, is the real wake up call for me was last December, and we were doing a call with one of our consultants, the much older fellow, great thinker, and French, And he said, look, I was used to, okay, the U.S. has sanctioned Venezuela, the U.S. has sanctioned Russia, the U.S. has sanctioned Iran. And he said, it is untenable that the U.S. can extend its foreign policy to the French government via the dollar. And just this huge multi-billion-dollar fine on BNP is going to make a U.S. ally want to think of a new way of doing business. So, like you have this new term, the global South, that wants out of the dollar system. Very interesting if French Republic wants out of the dollar system.
So based on American policymakers weaponizing the dollar system the way that they had, they were even getting to the point where you have longstanding key American allies who are like, hey, maybe actually we need to start thinking about getting out of the system. And so he's saying, in the East, you're starting to see the beginnings of how they're going to try to navigate this process, starting with oil and using the rupee and the yuan to start settling oil transactions instead of dollars. So you're seeing the process of that beginning. This needs to be arrested in the middle of it. So if you have the global South, which would be a BRICS essentially, you have the global South trying to de-dollarize. Well, if you have Europe start trying to de-dollarize as well, and you already have the East de-dollarizing, this is like red alarm bells for the United States. And it was because of the policy of the existing American politicos that was driving that.
Yes, and the seizing Russia's reserves has probably only accelerated that.
Yeah, they haven't been seized. I'm told they're frozen, right? Wow. But my inclination is that they will disappear.
So all of this,
and that was a big thing, like the actually seizing the Russian reserves was a BFD, because if it's one thing if it's Venezuela or whatever, but once you get to Russia, and it's funny, he's like, I'm told they're technically they're not seized, but they're going to be.
All of this debt swirling around the system, one is, as an investor, should be thinking about the preservation of purchasing power almost above all, and therefore currencies has always been a relative game. And I sometimes get some criticism from my partner, Will Campion, about the fact that I'm a long-term believer in gold and a distruster of the central banks. You have written about gold and have painted a scenario.
Gold is not a fiat currency. There's a limited amount. It is recognized as a store of value. And, you are seeing that you can keep gold in your vault. You can move it back. I am adamantly anti-Russian, but the mistake the Russians made was the Russians got onto war footing in terms of their foreign exchange reserves, but they moved out of dollars into euros. And they never believed that the Europeans would have the wherewithal, the inclination to follow the Americans. If the Russians had moved entirely into gold, price would be higher, but they would have all their reserves in Moscow. So I think a lot of who knows whether China's moving on to war footing vis-a-vis Taiwan. The Chinese PBOC is the largest buyer of gold now. So could we imagine, again, back to imagination, could we imagine some kind of a RMB that is exchangeable into gold, maybe at a premium?
So,
which is like, they're already well on their way to creating something like that. And it was fascinating to me listening to this, knowing it happened in October of 2023, and then seeing everything that happened with gold over the past year or so, where very obviously the United States has started significantly accumulating gold. China has been significantly accumulating gold, and Europe has been getting bankrupted of their gold. So I just got to say, if you watch this guy talking, do you think, given what he's saying here, how he's talking here, do you think that it's remotely possible that the gold is not in Fort Knox? Do you think Scott Bessent, as Treasury Secretary, would even begin to comprehend allowing that to be a reality?
I don't disagree with any of that, which is probably why I find myself constantly sort of rolling my eyes when people mention Bitcoin.
Gold can be a risk off and a risk on asset. Bitcoin is a risk on asset. So
plot that chart of Bitcoin against Tesla. Up until recently, it had a correlation.
There's another one of those that he's saying Bitcoin is a risk on asset, and he is a Bitcoin. I think you probably call him a Bitcoin bull. He's definitely very pro Bitcoin, but it is it is interesting to see that. It's not a huge observation, but it is interesting to see that he says that, and he does the same thing again, where he's kind of like, you pick up what I'm laying down here. That, in other words, like gold is dual purpose. Bitcoin is the Bitcoin is a risk on asset, meaning that it is, if I was to follow the chain of logic here, not necessarily saying this is the plan, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. If your goal was for the United States to capitalize on Bitcoin accumulation and appreciation, then you would induce a circumstance whereby people want to go into risk-on assets after the United States has accumulated sufficient supply. So you would want to create that risk-on environment so that people will flood into Bitcoin, driving up the price after the U.S. government has already established its claim to it.
That was almost perfectly won.
Yeah, and as someone who spends a lot of time in the Bahamas, one is skeptical about some aspects of crypto and getting it back.
Enough said.
So there's another one of those. He's doing his speaking a little obliquely, but as one who spends a lot of time in the Bahamas, one is skeptical about a lot of aspects of crypto. So again, this is another thing that hints at, like, he's very well aware of what crypto markets have been used for, namely transnational crime syndicates, money laundering, and paying for terrorism and everything. So like when they say, as Luongo says, when they say that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and stuff are vehicles for terrorism and fraud, they're confessing. That's what they're using it for.
I've said, let us talk about Japan. You have had, I think, rich pickings there in the past. You've been writing about it again. I'm going to just quote you when you say the Bank of Japan will be the final central bank to exit from ultra-loose monetary policy, and the global ramifications will be profound. Now, as I follow these currencies, I did run the charts the other day. I think that Japan's purchasing power parity is at the most extreme ever witnessed. So that's either the elastic has been stretched or it's the first of these collapsing currencies courtesy of its debt. How are you thinking about Japan, number one, and how are you planning and playing the three legs of that stool, which is the FX, the bond market, and the equity market?
Right. So little history. I went to Japan first time in 1990, 91, spent 90 days at the Okura Hotel. It was a then incredible price of $500 a night. The Okura Hotel, they just remodeled it, but it's still about $500 a night. We're sitting here in London. I'm not sure. I can get a shed for $500 a night. So Japan, if we rewind to 2011, we had this terrible. It's easy to remember. 3/11/11, the terrible Fukushima incident, and Japan looked completely helpless. The yen, they strengthened. They've been through a series of prime ministers, and they had this gigantic current account because after the collapse of the bubble, I'll go back, is 91, the Nikkei peaked and then just kept dribbling down for 20 years. And we were just the opposite then. So the yen was 78 to 82. And it was on PPP, which we use as a gauge. Trading currencies off PPP, you lose all your money because currencies can stay cheap or expensive longer than you can stay solvent. But it was the most expensive currency in the world. And we come back around summer 2012. China was starting to rattle the saber over the Senkaku Islands. The Japanese were feeling set upon. The Obama administration had basically shown up and said, not so much. You're not relevant anymore. And the Japanese panicked. One of our consultants called and said, there's this fellow named Abe. He used to be the prime minister. He's going to come back. He's got this program. And at the time, it was called 3, 3, and 3. Then he changed it to 2, 2, and 2. 2% inflation, 2 years, 2% inflation, 2% growth. And, back to imagination. No one believed he could do it. But, so we had a theory. And then it turned out that there were all these seats opening up on the Bank of Japan, including the chairmanship. And, so you had a cheap currency and the potential political will to change that. And, off the bottom in October, the yen was trading 78 to 82. By the spring of 2013, what we call Abenomics had taken place. New chairman of the Bank of Japan, a new governor of the Bank of Japan, Governor Kuroda, put in the big boom, went to ultra loose monetary policy. And I remember George Soros and I went up to Yale and visited one of the architects of Abenomics. And we had lunch with him. And on the way back, George said, "Do you think this is going to work?" And I said, "I have no idea, but it's going to be the market ride of a lifetime." And it has been. It's been incredible.
So he's been we've talked before about Scott Bessent's connections to Japan. He is a deep Japan appreciator and has been following him very closely for a long time, and was an Abe appreciator. An interesting little thing in there was that one of the architects of Abenomics was at Yale. Kind of interesting. So I was having conversations with Grok on other aspects of this, trying to synthesize some of the components of what he's talking about. There was one thing regarding back to gold. One of the things he says, he's not promising a gold standard. He's ranking physical, sovereign, non-seizable collateral above every paper claim. Fast forward, he confirms Fort Knox is there. U.S. gold is the world's largest pile, greater than $1 trillion at market. That's something they come to here in a little bit. Venezuela gold is coming in, and the dollar is explicitly fiat. Markets treat his long-end buybacks as debasement, and gold rips. The Shanghai Gold Exchange being very interesting is the early nod that London's pricing monopoly is already leaking. And so then Bessent draining the LBMA and the LME leverage sits on that same observation. And then with Japan, he says, Grok says he spends more time on Japan than on China, Ukraine, or AI. That's the tell. He walks Abenomics from 78 to 82 yen to 148 plus, calls it the ride of a lifetime, and then says the next leg is this what he's coming to in just a minute. So I'll wait on that. We'll just let this play.
So we go into 78 on the yen. I think when I walked in this morning, it was approximately 148.20. I think it peaked at 152.70. And now they have the opposite problem. They were in deflation. Now no one could imagine that Japan could have an inflationary spiral. And since 1991, Japan has actually, you call it the malaise, but Japan has actually done an incredible smoothing operation. And they've just added more debt. And they've actually had, in terms of statistically measured recession, they've only had very few down quarters because they've just spent so much government money. So, had a huge amount of real estate debt. The government then took it on, and now they monetized the debt. And now they're seeing real inflation, both imported globally and for the first time, wage inflation. So I think that they are running a high pressure economy. And to get back to your question on the three asset classes, my guess is that the Nikkei and the Topix are going to break through the all-time high. That they're part of Abenomics. There's ultra loose monetary policy, but there's this incredible sea change in Japanese corporate behavior. So that's back to observing the companies used to keep a lot of cash on the balance sheet, and my friend Jim Grant.
There's a really, really key insight here.
And actually had a Japan fund that was based on the old Ben Graham net cash position. And I said, well, Jim, it's a good idea, but in a way, the most dangerous thing is a Japanese company with a lot of cash because they'll do something crazy with it. Right? They have this incredible manufacturing ability, and they are less good in financial transactions. So now we're seeing excellent return on capital. The Abe administration.
So basically, they when you part of the Japanese psychology, when they have a lot of cash, they'll just spend that cash, but they're not super I guess sophisticated or judicious about how they spend it. They just kind of go crazy spending it. So he's tracking through the way that the Japanese financial system went through essentially a complete reset through Abenomics, and are in the process of navigating their way out of, or really have navigated their way through a big point of crisis, which is interesting. This was something Matt Dines was saying in the episode I did a couple weeks back, or a week or so back, where he talked about how you had the big the big Japanese financial crisis in the 90s, and that actually since then they've been right-sizing things over the past couple of decades. And he says something kind of similar to that coming up here.
administration put in minimum returns, or you get delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So I think over the next few years that probably Tokyo will do the best of any major market. And the other thing that's happened too is you're seeing this reshoring in Japan. The semiconductor industry, I was talking to someone, there is a university down toward Okinawa, and Taiwan Semi is hiring every graduate this year, and they're doubling their salaries. So, again, Japan, in terms of kind of offshoring, the U.S. changing supply chains, Japan's a key component. On the currency, there's a new governor, Governor Ueda. I've met with him many times. I think he's an incredible thinker. For an academic, he loves markets. When I was at his office at University of Tokyo, there's a Bloomberg, unlike my office, the pulsing in the background. And I think he's realized that they've been successful in getting them out of deflation. And I think we've got to have a lot of imagination in, so Japan is in NIRP right now, negative interest rate policy. If you have this huge pile of savings and savers who have gotten nothing on them, if you need to raise rates to 1% or if you do raise rates to 1% to stop inflation, strengthen the currency, could you really end up with something that picks up a lot of strength because Japanese are huge savers? So now you're handing them extra cash. It's almost like a helicopter drop into their bank accounts. And I think no one's imagining what that could look like.
You're talking about the Japanese psychology. They are, as a naturally very conservative people, they have a desire to accumulate lots of cash. They're big savers. They want to save. And they've persisted being that way, even at negative interest rates. So he's forecasting here back almost 3 years ago. Imagine if the Bank of Japan started raising rates to where now they're actually paying their people to continue maintaining that cash. So they've combated the deflationary spiral, and now they're entering basically a new cycle. And you can tell the way that he's talking that he really respects a lot of what they've done and sees it sort of as a model for a way that you can run a really hot economy, but actually do it productively. And when you do it in correspondence with onshoring. And he sees the Japanese market as a buy low opportunity. This is Bessent, the investor, 3 years ago, saying he sees the Japanese market as a buy low opportunity. Fast forward now, and you have Bessent buying into the Japanese economy as the Treasury Secretary. And he's detailing how he and Ueda have known each other for a long time and have a deep personal understanding of each other.
In 6 or 9 months. And one of the things we think about a lot is policymakers are people. Jerome Powell reads what the New York Times writes about him. Ben Bernanke wrote a book, sounded like he was the head of SEAL Team 6, like The Courage to Act or something. And I think Governor Ueda will understand that the Prime Minister Abe was assassinated. The legacy of Abenomics, they don't want it to end up with a financial bust, either in Japan or globally. So I think they will move to quell inflation early.
So I remember working with Barton Biggs, and one of my most successful PA trades was buying the dollar against the yen when the yen was so strong. And so I've been sort of itching to put that trade on. But right now the market has just played the advantage of the higher US interest rates and short of the yen. What will be the trigger for you to get really long the yen?
Yeah, so it'll be twofold. Is one, I would say that there is a position, because I perceive there's been a change in monetary policy. So we've had a change in personnel with Governor Ueda. He has started hinting that there is going to be a policy change. And, we are observing from Japanese corporates a pattern of price increases that, if you hadn't raised prices for 20 years, you start out at 2 or 3%. Now they're raising prices 8 to 12%. And it'll be a 1-2 combination, because it'll be a combination of Japan is coming out on this side. And then, with the U.S., yesterday we just took out 2 interest rate cuts for next year, clarified a hike for this year. So, my guess is you see some kind of back to currencies being relative. You see a big relative change in expectations that the Fed has maybe finally slowed the economy which is difficult given the amount of government spending. But that the Bank of Japan is just beginning a cycle. So the Fed, we'll see. Have they gone a step too far? But they are closer to the end than the beginning, and the Bank of Japan is just at the beginning of the cycle. So we want to see both legs to have a full position. But again, the market's giving you a lot here. It is very few people are interested in owning the yen. If you look at the CTA, the commitment to short yen, quite large.
Let's just pause and look at China.
So he's describing the yen carry trade there too, the commitment to shorting the yen, and the way he sees the Japanese economy right now is that they've basically finished a cycle and they're starting a new one. Whereas in the American economy, basically the Fed has had to keep interest rates high to account for all of this extra government money that's been spent through the COVID and the Biden years, and now the Japanese economy, and as of October 2023, when he was saying this, he says they're ready to now start raising rates, and they're reindustrializing themselves as they're raising rates. So they're gonna they're a buy low opportunity. Now the United States is following along behind them. So actually his actions most recently, I think, are properly seen as the United States using the Japanese economy as a way of leveraging everything else. They're basically combining their actions to leverage what Japan has done already and follow along in a similar way with the United States and pair the futures of the economies together, rising out of, the doldrums of the last however many decades. This interview was October 26, 2023. So this is long before Bessent was even into conversation for Treasury Secretary.
China, and what are their fiscal and monetary options? And you said that we're seeing the end of a multi-decade leverage cycle in China. How are you thinking about China as an investor?
So not Chinese New Year 2023, but 2022, I was invited to a very, very nice dinner in New York, and everyone had followed China for a long time. So you can imagine the early 22, people still very constructive on China. And I had a long-term secular down view based both on economics, gravity, because somehow everyone thought, well, China's so big, they have this closed capital account. If it were any other country, it already would have exploded. But the view that gravity would win. And then I also had the view that when Party Chairman Xi came in, he's a different kind of cat. And this very unusual capitalist communist blend that had taken China out of the dark ages and into the modern world was over. So now we've seen they've gone to more of a command and control economy. But so at this dinner, I told everyone at the table, I said, you can have China. I will take India and Japan. Let's reconvene in 5 years. So, I think it's this Leninist model versus the Japanese democratic model, and then the Indian very loud democratic model. But I think you can.
The Indian very loud democratic model. So it's interesting seeing his perspective on China as I'm sure at this point he may have been thinking of himself as giving an interview as a future potential Treasury Secretary, but this is still pretty early. I think the real serious conversations about him being Treasury Secretary didn't really start until the summer. But you never know. But the way he's describing China is basically like he doesn't really believe in them. He doesn't think that Xi is a different sort of cat. And essentially that they're, by moving to this more command and control economy, they're actually, it's sort of they're trying to centrally plan something that can't really be centrally planned in the way they're trying to centrally plan it. So he doesn't actually believe that that they have the same sort of potential as at least as an investment opportunity. There's a couple other notes here that I had from Grok. Let's say, so this thing with yeah, let's read this down here. So dollar thirst before dollar boycott. He was not predicting a triumphant dollar forever. He was describing sequence. Countries still have to service dollar debt and roll reserves before they can walk. That's why, as secretary, he will buy yen so Japan does not dump treasuries, double long yen buybacks when the coupon riots, and talk strong dollar as fundamentals, not DXY. A disorderly boycott is a treasury crisis. A managed cheapening of the dollar that does not blow the long end is policy. This week's gold up, dollar down reaction is the market naming the trade he'll not name. And then when he mentioned gold you can keep in a vault versus euros that the Europeans will freeze, the knowing look was paper claims on other people's legal systems are not reserves anymore. There's a good line. Paper claims on other people's legal systems are not reserves anymore. Russians should have been in gold. China is buying gold. He floated an RMB that might one day be exchangeable into gold at a premium. What he has done, he's confirmed the U.S. pile exists, cited market value over $1 trillion, taken Venezuelan gold, and then refused to revalue the statutory 42.22 book price of gold or seed a sovereign wealth fund with it. That refusal is the tell. Revaluation is a crisis tool and a political nuclear option. He wants gold priced by the market as the world's other reserve asset, while the U.S. keeps the option unexercised. So the revaluation thing, it's one of those, like, it's kind of like blackmail. Like, once you use it, you lose some of the utility of having it. So maintaining that option as a, you never know when it might happen. But if you haven't played that card, that means you still retain the ability to play that card. So other market participants are going to have to keep that in mind. The metal is the backstop of the system he is defending, not a campaign slogan. The Shanghai Gold Exchange being very interesting. He was already watching pricing migrate off of London. He has not declared war on the LBMA. He has also not defended it. Combined with industrial metal statecraft like Project Vault and the critical minerals, the implication for the rest of Trump's term is let the East and the U.S. physical markets eat London's paper leverage rather than hold a conference about it. And then with Japan, he treated Japan as the last big pool of savings that can still break the U.S. coupon if the yen goes, because of the savings culture in Japan. In office, he has acted exactly that way. Coordinated yen buys, whatever it takes, because a weak yen forces Japan to sell what it can sell, treasuries, into an AI and deficit supply glut. For 26 to 28, expect Japan to stay the valve. If the yen slumps again, he intervenes. If Japan tries to tighten too fast, he talks them down. The old yen carry world is being retired on American terms, not London's. And then we've got some more. We're going to talk about AI here in a little bit too.
And for the avoid China. And look, I think that they can have a cyclical bounce here within the secular down. They have some very difficult policy decisions to make. They've starved the consumer or starved households in favor of manufacturing. And doing the rebalancing is very painful. You have a lot of vested interest, and especially at the state and local level, and you've got to move it over to the households. And these municipalities, states are not going to sell off assets willingly, but it's got to be done. And then you have the Taiwan question. I would say that is we try not to play fort and predict these things, but
we try not to play fort, otherwise known as doing political analysis by action figure, like John Doyle speaks of this.
I think we have to imagine. Our mutual friend Neil Ferguson wrote a very good piece last week, and it had two parts to it. One was, are the U.S. and China in mutually assured financial destruction? So, in game theory, an escalating tit for tat is one of the worst patterns. So, the U.S., kneecaps Chinese tech growth by a high-end semiconductor ban, and then Chinese government starts getting a little squishy about Apple. Maybe government officials can't have them. Maybe there's been a security breach. So, if we see that financial tit for tat, that's a market event. I think, we'll see.
That's a market event is a nice understatement.
Taiwan has elections in January. The leading separatist candidate is doing quite well. He's pretty aggressive. We'll see what U.S. policy is. And I think we have until the election to see, but we'll see how President Xi responds. That we're concerned. They have been sucking in oil imports. So, like, if you were going to go on war footing, you would need energy, you would need food, and then you would probably sell your treasuries.
So before...
So if China was going to go on a war footing, then they would be stockpiling energy and food and selling treasuries. So I guess as Treasury Secretary then, when one of your primary responsibilities is ensuring that there's a market for treasuries, then perhaps you might make it harder for them to stockpile oil and food, and thus also make it more difficult for them to sell their treasuries.
Before we leave China, I had this macro question, which is if you're a bottom-up investor, you'd look at Alibaba or Tencent, you'd say world-class companies operating with great profitabilities and trajectories. I'm sort of drawn to them. Does the macro investor go, I don't care because the geopolitical risk and uncertainty is too profound?
I think there are two things here. Is one, are you a tactical investor? And these things could be very interesting. Or are you an endowment long-term investor? And at that point, what everyone always asks me, what is risk? And I said probability and severity. So, if you think about those positions, what is the probability that you are going to have 100% loss? It is not zero. That you walk in one day and you have just had a Russia into Ukraine event and the stocks went to zero, or you're not allowed to own them anymore. So, but I see your point that we are getting to, if I just look at a chart, because I was looking at the chart of the K-Web, which is the China Internet Index, it looks like you could go down 10% and maybe up 50. But there's probably a 20% chance you can go down 100%. So, when you think about it in terms of outcomes, so for tactical investors, very interesting. For an endowment, a pension fund, a sovereign wealth fund, probably less interesting.
So he's asking, what the guy had asked him about was the big Chinese companies like Alibaba and stuff. And basically, like, what do you see them as investments? And he's saying, well, there's two things you have to evaluate here. You have to evaluate, like, what's the upside potential of them, and then what's the likelihood, what's the upside and downside potential, and then what is the likelihood that it reaches that potential. So if it has you see a case where it could go up 100%, that might make it a great investment. But if you have a 20% chance of taking a 100% loss because of policy reasons, where you are ordered by the government to divest, or you get seized, or any sort of black swan event happens, then you need to make sure that you as an investor are prepared for to manage that kind of an event. So if you're he says a tactical investor, in other words, someone who has maybe a little more independence to operate and a little more toleration for risk. But if you're a big institutional investor, then and you're looking for long, stable investments, then perhaps China is not the place to go for long, stable investments.
Very well put. Now, as we talked about military conflict, here we have this Ukraine situation. It was General Petraeus, who was on the show in January, who said all wars end in a conversation. And one can imagine that has to be, a high probability that there is a conversation. And with it then, the next step becomes a rebuild of Ukraine, potentially of a scale that we haven't seen.
Exactly.
How are you thinking about exploring that theme?
Right. So for us, framing a problem is the most important thing. Can we, and if we're losing money, I usually think our framing is incorrect. So in terms of framing the scenario you just outlined, I think I don't have to worry about that yet, because I don't know what I would say there's an 80% probability Donald Trump is a Republican candidate. Is there a 40% probability that he wins the general election? If you were Vladimir Putin and former President Trump has said, I am going to end the war in 24 hours, you're not settling. So November 5th, 2024 is when the talking probably starts. Right? It is, Trump wins, comes in January 20th, there's a conversation. Biden or the Democratic candidate wins again, then maybe Putin, I'm not.
It's funny he says Biden or the Democratic candidate. It's funny looking back at this now from he's in 2023. He's like talking seriously about Trump. What did he say? There's like a 60% chance that he wins, or that he's the Republican candidate, or say 80% chance that he's a Republican candidate and 40% chance that he wins the election, versus Biden or whatever other Democratic candidate. It's funny remembering that time and being like, are they really going to run Biden again?
Or the Democratic candidate wins again, then maybe Putin, I'm not in this for 24 more months. This is a meat grinder. I'm going to run out of prisoners from Vladivostok. So, when you game out the potential pass, I think no conversation starts until November 5th. Like we always focus on signposts. Again, I think that like you don't have to have a conversation. You can have lots of observations, but I don't have to have a conversation on what China might do in Taiwan until I'm cuffing it. But I think the Taiwanese election is January 17th, is DPP, which is the anti-unification party, wins. Then you got to start thinking, could this turn kinetic? My guess is it's more of a blockade. Right. But look, this Ukraine tragedy, there will be an incredible rebuild. It'll be something, back to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And I think what you've said is, as I look back at my own investing career spanning.
That's another interesting note there. Given they started the conversation out talking about the financial implications of German reunification and the market mechanics that played out there that tied directly into him shorting the pound. And so now he the way he's viewing Ukraine, like whether you agree with it or not, I'm just saying it's interesting that the way he views Ukraine is that it's essentially kind of like it's going to be like East Germany being brought back into the global economy, so to speak.
Since starting in the mid-'80s, and if there's been a persistent mistake, it's trying to be too early. And what you're saying is that you need maybe a convergence of the fundamentals and also the technicals.
I always tell everyone who works with me, we're not a think tank. We're a money management firm. And the technicals, Bruce Kovner has this great saying, is an investor who doesn't look at technicals is like a doctor without a stethoscope. And I think even like Barton loved technicals. So like the mind of the market. I don't think I'm smarter than the market, and I certainly don't think I have more liquidity than the market. But there are a lot of signals.
Which, of course, leads us, well, it may not, of course, it's going to lead me to talk about AI. Now, you've written about how AI can impact productivity. You've also talked about how regulation could help or hinder countries. I'm thinking of the US juxtaposed with Europe, in that regard. How are you thinking about what AI does, and how is it, or do you think it will influence your positioning?
Yeah, so my guess is it is business out 2 or 3 years, but we're also already starting to see it. That I was on a Zoom with one of the most prominent tech overlords, and he said he kind of, for those of us on the Zoom, he did a trip around the world, and he said China will never let AI meaningfully into the private sector because they will be convinced that maybe Jack Ma with AI could take down the CCP. So you will not get this private sector productivity enhancement in China. He was of the view that Europe was already starting to regulate it away. And unfortunately, the UK seems to be following the European model. And the US, as we tend to do in the US, he said, was the wild, wild west. And it could be incredible productivity gains for the US if we don't blow ourselves up. But,
yeah, that sounds almost exactly like it was Elon who he was talking to, which would be very interesting if Scott Bessent was on a call with Elon in October of 2023. Please do tip your streamer, folks. Tips.kingpill.com, or gift a sub, or Cash App, Venmo, at Kingpilled for both of those. If you do those, just let me know and I'll add them to the tip goal. We are not that far away. Someone could still make a little money tonight. We've got another 15 minutes. Roy!
Replay gang checking and standing by.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Roy's Redemption. We've got about 15 minutes left on this video, and then I've got some closing thoughts as well, so we'll go just a little bit longer. So yeah, please do tip your streamer.
But you're starting to see the use case for this. My guess is the big winners, just like with the internet, no one knew. Google was founded in '98, appeared in the early 2000s, so 3 or 5 year lag. Facebook, Amazon. So like those companies don't exist yet. My guess is the super scalers who are trying to get on this, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Oracle, Meta, are going to be spending a lot of CapEx. They may or may not be the big winners. And the big winners could actually be U.S. corporates who are able to get these big productivity gains. So, you could imagine 2 or 3 years out, this big cut in employment in maybe white collar employment, back office.
So in short, would you say that AI has extraordinary possibilities, but huge dispersion in how governments respond around the world? And as an investor, you're watching closely.
That's a fantastic summary. And if I think about what is today's business with AI, I would think these hyperscalers are the most cash-rich and we could come back to the sucking liquidity out.
This is a really, really important point that he makes here. And it kind of parallels what he was talking about with Japan and them having this big savings glut. And Japan being basically like one of the biggest savings gluts remaining in the world. There's kind of a parallel here with what he's talking about the big hyperscalers.
Are the most cash-rich and we could come back to the sucking liquidity out of the system. The hyperscalers are the most cash-rich companies in the U.S. And, I think Apple would probably be the biggest sovereign wealth fund after Norway. So, I think I left them off the hyperscaler list. The hyperscalers are probably going to spend between $500 billion and $1 trillion on the data centers for AI. I mean, this is an arms race. And what happens when they start spending the cash rather than accumulating it? What happens when Apple is selling IG credit to have, bricks, mortars, and NVIDIA chips near a power facility in Nebraska, right? So like this is just another model change in terms of the savings glut actually getting pushed into the real economy.
Which, of course, brings us to this.
So the savings glut getting pushed into the real economy. So you have all these hyperscalers, all these big companies that have been sitting on all of this cash, and you're giving them a productive, or they have a productive outlet for it, for actually pushing that cash into the real economy. One of the things that Grok had said about this, that AI CapEx is a liquidity event, not a tech story. That says Apple selling IG credit for chips and Nebraska Power is the savings glut actually getting pushed into the real economy. In 2026, that crowding out is exactly why the long end blew out and why he's making a market in 10s and 30s. He saw the bid for capital coming while people were still arguing about chatbots. And then there was one other thing here. He saw the crowding out of the long bond in 2023. In 2026, he is the bid on the long end because hyperscalers and the deficit showed up at the same auction. For the rest of the term, he'll keep trying to shorten the coupon and cap the long end without calling it yield curve control. When it fails for more than a day, as it just did, gold and Bitcoin will keep scoring it as debasement. And like that's tying that in with his commentary on gold and Bitcoin. It says here, he was skeptical of crypto as a monetary asset from the Bahamas vantage. In office, he split the difference with precision. No U.S. CBDC, yes to dollar stables. As an internet-native payment rail free of middlemen. Genius Act as a way to force T-bill demand, so the short-term debt, to force the T-bill demand and keep issuance onshore, and then clarity as the remaining plumbing bill. Bitcoin is tolerated as a satellite or strategic reserve conversation. It's not the dollar. The redesign, this part right here, listen to this. The redesign is dollar stables on the short end, treasuries in the middle, gold as the unseizable residual. That is the actual architecture. Dollar stables on the short end, treasuries in the middle, gold as the unseizable residual. We'll come back to that here in a little bit.
This question I have in front of me, which was sort of summarizing today's climate. And you've written a lot about this savings glut. We all know about these cumulative levels of debt. We all read the history books and know that, inflating your way out is one of the routes. But summarizing today, it's a paradigm shift. It's a changed order. Is that fair?
Yeah, look, we've had 40 years of deflation or disinflation, and now we're going the other way. So I started university in 1980. starting the investment business in 1984. For my entire adult life, capital has gotten treated better to the detriment of labor. Thatcher came in 79, Reagan came in 80, and then, life just kept getting better for owners of capital. NAFTA, WTO, and we come back to this AI, because I would say for the U.S. or for the developed world, my hope would be that if there is an AI employment displacement, that we would handle it better than we did with the manufacturing displacement. That we don't end up with kind of a Luddite revolution. But it is a model change. So I believe you said you were born in 63. I was born in 62. The baby boom bulge is about 54 to 56. So now
this is another really interesting point. I love the way he thinks about these sorts of things.
The baby boom bulge is about 54 to 56. So in the U.S., very good things happen to you when you turn 65 in terms of government benefits, Social Security, the federal health care. And my team thinks that one of the things that happened under the cover of COVID, and everyone's blaming it on COVID, and I think it did accelerate like COVID did everything, but I think under the cover of COVID, the baby boom bulge turned 65. So they were always going to leave. And that got accelerated during the pandemic. And so we've got this incredible labor shortage.
So if you're thinking about just birthdays, you have that bulge in the baby boom. In other words, the years where the boomer generation had the most babies born. So then you fast forward 65 years, the year at which they're presumably going to exit the workforce, or at least substantially change their engagement with the workforce. Well, that happened under COVID. So you have a bunch of people who left the workforce who are always going to leave the workforce right around then. And so you're trying to disambiguate the different elements here. Is the change in the market, is the change in the labor market, there's immigration, obviously deportations are one part of it. There's the baby boomers just reaching the age at which they leave the market. That was always going to happen anyways. Then you have AI on top of that that's going to have a major impact on the labor market as well. So we're talking about disambiguating all of these things. And when he mentioned, just to put a fine point on this, when he mentioned the savings glut from the hyperscalers being pushed into the real economy, what he's alluding to there is, instead of them maintaining all of this cash on their balance sheets and just sitting on it, they're actually pushing it out in the economy, employing people, which is going to have upward pressure on wages. So for the last 40 plus years, capital has been accumulating to the capital people. And now it's time for that capital to start going the other way and start pushing out into the real economy and going to labor, which is going to have an inflationary effect. So we're going to have to run it hot, because this is just like a natural downstream effect of all of these things combining at once.
I think that someone in my office told me this week there are 1,000 pilots at United Airlines who are going to make over $1 million this year. I was actually getting a UPS package when the UPS labor strike was settled, and I congratulated the fellow, and he said, "Oh yeah, my wife is already spin it." And you're seeing that. I think that you're seeing this UAW strike on autos, and my sense is that the American people are behind the strikers, which is first time in my working career that the public is with them. So anyway, that was a long way of saying we're going to see a very natural shift back from an overshoot in the amount of the profits going to capital, and it's got to come back to labor.
And a reaction to executive hyperpay and some bad behavior.
Terrible behavior. And is like this leader of the UAW is quite charismatic, but he's making the point: we only want the same increase that the CEO of Ford got. But we just want what you get. Why did you get it? But again, on the other hand, is what's the future for those workers?
So when we think about the portfolio that you run, and we'll talk a little bit about your fund in a minute, you've obviously got this sourcing of ideas and then the positioning. And Jim Rogers said about risk, you've got to look down before you look up.
Yep.
And Michael Mauboussin, who I'm interviewing this afternoon at the London Quality Growth Conference, had this number. I don't know if he's right that when you were all at Soros, the success rate was only around 30%, but your position sizing must have been outstanding because you made such great returns. How do you think, is that true? And how do you think about the position sizing and the managing of that risk?
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned Michael, because he was chairman for many years of this incredible organization called the Santa Fe Institute, and the way they think about systems. And so Simon, back to when you said what is macro? Macro is thinking about systems, and can the system accelerate? Could the system break down? And I think the 30% is low. That might have been a number that George Soros said about himself one time. And for American baseball, probably the most famous player in history is Babe Ruth. Home run king, strikeout king. So in macro, it's how much do you make when you're right, how much do you lose when you're wrong? And kind of back to either, I think I told you that
Mr. Sousis, look how much more chill he is when he's not treasury. Yeah, I said earlier before I started watching it that it stood out to me how, I said he's a spitfire. Like he's got all this more kind of energy and sort of charisma, and you can tell that he's much more guarded and careful, and obviously probably under a lot of stress now.
Even though our firm name's based on a chess move, I actually think investing is much more like cards or backgammon. You don't know.
Like cards. Isn't that very interesting? Tom Luongo has often said that chess is the wrong game to use if you want to understand what's happening right now. That it's more like no limit Texas Hold'em.
Know what the dealer is going to give you, or you don't know what the dice are going to give you. Chess, everything's on the board. Does your opponent make a mistake? So I remember being at the Santa Fe Institute conference, and one of the speakers was talking about what competence ratio do you need to get to increase your position? So in theory, if you can get to 51%, then you should keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, I would say that, my philosophy, certainly Stan Druckenmiller's philosophy, he's incredible in thinking about asymmetry, is, what's the market giving me? What's my upside, downside? And how should I size that? I think that's what most people missed on the Sterling exit from the ERM was we could keep pushing the Bank of England up against the band. They would only push us back to the other side of the band. And there was a chance that maybe the band would break. If I think about in 2012 with the yen was, as you said, the most overvalued currency in the world. And the Bank of Japan was doing the worst kept, the secret of stealth intervention at about 78. So if I was shorting the yen at 80, I'd lose two big figures, but my imagination was right. I could make 20 or 30. Right. So it is, and then, it's adding when you get information, adding when things break down.
Now, this may not be true, but I was told that when you and Stan Druckenmiller presented the case for shorting the pound to George Soros, his initial reaction was one of what appeared to be dismay, but it was only because you weren't suggesting doing enough.
You have to remember, so 70s, especially the 70s, even into the 80s, markets trended much more. So, if you read The Alchemy of Finance, Plaza Accord happens, the currencies move 7%, but George is adding a 300% position because they're going to keep going. So, if you have a great idea, it can never be big enough. And I found, I think his quote is, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. I think there's a change in market structure, and either the fish can shoot back or the metal ties holding.
Isn't being more outwardly stressed and catty a gay man's flow state? Seems like he's in peak form to me.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. He's locked in now. Absolutely locked in. Bringing the cattiness out of him. Thank you, Ian. I just completely forgot what I was about to say. Oh, yeah. The story goes that when he and Druckenmiller went to Soros and brought this trade to him, he was basically like this is brilliant. My only problem is you don't have enough capital behind it. Like, you need to, if you believe in the trade, you need to bet with your nut sacks like double it, triple it, bigger, bigger, bigger. Very interesting that response by Soros was very Trumpian.
It's holding the barrel together, gotten bigger, and the bullet can bounce back and hit you. So you've got to be much more. You've got to be much more adept and much more attentive to the other players.
Let's just talk about Key Square, your fund. I believe you had a very good year last year. I think up 30% last year. You obviously have these high conviction macro views you express. You're open to new investors. Who are the sort of partners that you most like to welcome?
We like having a very iterative relationship. So I do think, for whatever reason, you tend to get these paradigm shifts, investment changes every 10 years, and they center around the decade. And I think we're in the midst of one now. And I don't know what the dominant theme is going to be for the rest of the 2020s, but I know it's not going to be what it was in the teens. It's also very helpful to hear people's incentives, what they're thinking, what they're leaning towards.
Mentors along the way who have been extremely important. And it just so happens that we were talking about David Darst, who was important to me at Morgan Stanley, and David Roach, in fact, from a distance, Barton Biggs. But what was it that Stan Druckenmiller that you most valued?
There's something called superstar syndrome that Michael Jordan probably couldn't teach us how to play basketball. Roger Federer was probably not the greatest tennis coach, but being able to sit, I'm not sure if Stan could explain why he always does what he does, but being able to sit next to him and watch him and they have the dialogue with him. But he's just incredible. There's a great trader. I said earlier, the combination of George Soros and Jim Rogers was incredible because of Jim's analytics and then George's trading instincts. Stan's that in one person. And, his risk management, it's incredible. He's never had a down year. It's humbling. The bad part about sitting next to him is you think, what am
I'm not good enough.
Yeah, I'm not good enough. But it's also that I go back. I'm a basketball fan. I go back and look, and if I look at the Chicago Bulls, that they were all better. Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, they were all better for playing with Michael Jordan.
So Scott, my gosh, we could have gone on.
Never in my life would I have expected to hear the name Horace Grant spoken by Scott Bessent. Okay, so let me just follow up with a few more thoughts here from my musings with the Grockler. So let's see here. So I said to Grok, I said, he often speaks a little opaquely, making allusions to things, but saying them with a sort of knowing look. I want to read between the lines on his comments with the benefit of hindsight with his actual actions as Treasury Secretary and use those insights to gain a clear look at where he sees things going over the rest of Trump's term, vis-a-vis the restructuring of the global dollar system. Grok says, Bessent's opacity is not mysticism, it's a macro trader's habit. Say the system and the signpost, not the press release version of the trade. In 2023, that sounded like color. After 18 months at Treasury, it reads like an operating manual for a managed repricing of the dollar system, not a clean break from it. He has been consistent on the destination. The dollar stays the primary reserve, quote, in my lifetime. The fight is over what the dollar is attached to, who gets to use the rail, and who no longer gets to set the price of the collateral. Then it says where he sees the system by January 2029. Not a gold standard, not the Eurodollar status quo, a barbell. First, payments in offshore dollar, U.S. regulated stablecoins, T-bill backed, replacing a chunk of the old correspondent bank / City of London stack. Rules finalized into 27 and 28. That's how you buttress reserve status, while the share of classic FX reserves keeps drifting down. Number 2, the coupon. Defended by issuance mix, buybacks, Japan as partner, and, if needed, a closer Treasury Fed understanding on the long end. The 3-3-3 talk, growth, deficit, and oil, is the real economy story that is supposed to make that politically survivable. If the deficit story fails, the toolkit gets more overt and gold keeps running. That was 3%, was it 3% growth, a 3% deficit, and 3 million barrels of oil, I think was what the 3-3-3 was. Number 3, collateral the rest of the world actually trusts. Gold at market prices, held by central banks, and now even by stablecoin issuers. U.S. gold stays on the books at $42.22 until a crisis or a second-term political decision makes the revaluation useful. He has left that door closed but not welded. Number 4 is access, dollar leadership as statecraft. Sanctions, boards of trade and investment with China, critical minerals reserves, IMF, World Bank missions stripped back to surplus recycling and exchange rate discipline. The Global South wants outline becomes they can settle oil in rupees and RMB at the margin. The system still clears in dollars if they want depth, law, and a rail that works. And then number 5, Europe and London says not the audience. The 2023 French consultant story was him noticing the alliance was already transactional. Rest of term, he will use that. If European banks and the LBMA lose pricing power, that's a feature of industrial power politics, not an accident he will rush to fix. So he said, Grok says, the dollar system is going to be repriced around collateral and access, and the people who still think in 2010's QE and Treasuries only terms are going to be late. He's not trying to kill the dollar. He's trying to stop the dollar from being only a claim on a Congress that will not close the deficit by bolting on A, a digital T-bill rail, B, a managed cheap dollar for trade, C, gold as the thing you hold when you no longer trust freezable reserves, and D, Japan is the ally you cannot let become a forced seller. Watch the signposts he actually uses. Yen stability, 10s and 30s after each refunding, stablecoin assets under management, and T-bill holdings. Whether he ever blinks on gold book value and how hard he gates Chinese and Iranian dollar access. Those are the key squares. The rest of the term is him adding to the position when the market gives it to him, the same rule he stated in that studio in London 3 years ago. And then I said, I've long suspected that the introduction/formalization of stablecoin rails and the renewed emphasis on gold, e.g. gold-backed bonds, a repricing event, and the formal adoption of Bitcoin as a formal or informal reserve asset will fundamentally alter interest rate policy and yield curve structure. So everyone panicking about excess bill issuance for stables is improperly valuing the impact of stablecoins on the overall stability and responsiveness of the system, and not appreciating that its new character is so much more programmable and responsive that, for example, higher rates on long-term debt and much more short-term issuance are bugs if viewed through the frame of the old system, but they're actually features going forward with the incoming new system. So they aren't transient indicators of crisis, but actually signals of the new market structure. But this is mostly just intuition. Most of the technicals with bond spreads, FX swaps, yield curves, etc. are over my head. And this is what Grok says. Your intuition is half a real plumbing change and half a frame that can hide a live risk. The useful move is to stop treating the yield curve as one object. Split the curve into 3 markets. First, you have bills, 0 to 3 months. They're a money market. Under the Genius Act, compliant stables must sit in cash, treasury repo, or treasuries with 93 days or less left. The coin in means the issuer buys the bills/repo. Coin out means the issuer sells them. That bid is fairly price inelastic. They're not stretching for yield the way a hedge fund is. Research already finds that inflows nibble 1 month and 3 month yields and do not reliably spill into 10s and 30s. So too many bills can look like a crisis in the 2010s frame and still be the system working if the new buyer is real. Tether alone is already in the same league as a mid-sized official holder on the bill book. Like, I'm pretty sure that Tether has more treasuries on their books than Germany. Forecasts in the 800 billion to 1 trillion extra bill demand range by 2028 are why Treasury has started talking about stables as a financing feature, not a sideshow. The belly of the curve, the 2s and 7s, is still mostly what the Fed will do. Stables barely live here. The long end, 10s to 30s, is duration. Inflation path, deficit path, and who is willing to sit in a 30-year claim on Congress. Gold and Bitcoin compete for that bid, the store of value bid, not the payments bid. A 3-month bill at around 3.9% and a 30-year near 5.3% with a 10-year term premium around 1.3 points is the market charging rent for time. That's not the front end failed, it's the long end refusing to be as cheap as it was when official buyers in QE ate duration. That split is why your bug versus feature line can be true and why Bessent still spent this week trying to bid the long end. He's treating high 30s as a problem for housing, refinancing, and politics, even while he wants more bill demand from stables. So then what programmable and responsive actually means? It's real at the front and it cuts both ways. Mint is automatic demand. A foreign firm that used to hold a bank deposit or a Eurodollar claim can now hold a token that is mechanically a claim on T-bills. That is a new fast rail for dollar float. It can make the short dollar system more elastic than waiting on correspondent banks and FX swap lines. Redeem is automatic supply. A DPEG, a crypto risk off, or a run on one large issuer dumps bills into the same market that just loved the bid. Brookings is blunt. More bills lower average funding cost and raise rollover risk and the volatility of debt service. That's not old frame cope. That is the price of shortening the government's weighted average maturity. So people yelling excess bill issuance equals crisis are often using the wrong diagnostic. People saying, therefore the long end doesn't matter, are using the wrong one too. Where gold and Bitcoin do and do not change rate policy. Gold-backed bonds and a gold repricing event are not current Treasury policy. Bessent has confirmed the metal, talked market value, and refused statutory revaluation off of $42.22. Until that changes, gold alters the curve as a competing reserve, not as a coupon the Treasury pays. High gold is consistent with a fatter term premium on long Treasuries, the same world in which duration is no longer the only safe long asset. Bitcoin as reserve is real but narrow. There is a strategic Bitcoin reserve from forfeitures, a no-sale policy, and a fight over who runs it. There is no funded open market purchase program. Now, but part of the reason why Bitcoin just started nuking over the last couple of days is because Trump said that he brought this up again and said, like, we're gonna keep adding Bitcoin. We're gonna keep buying it. Bessent backs the reserve and clarity. He does not run monetary policy off Bitcoin. Bitcoin can sit in the same psychological bucket as gold for the long end store of value bid. It does not set Fed funds, and it does not, under Genius, back the payment dollar. Interest rate policy is still the overnight rate. What can change is Treasury debt management and, at the margin, how the Fed thinks about the bill market. They've already been adding bills even while reserves fell. That's an operating regime shift, not a new Taylor rule. So the part of your thesis that holds, a barbell can be the intended new structure. So barbell, barbell shape. On the front, you have regulated dollar stables plus T-bills plus repo as the programmable euro-dollar replacement. More short issuance is then a feature. You issue into a dedicated 24/7-ish bid, and you extend the dollar rail without a CBDC. So that was the front. On the long end, you have fewer captive official buyers of 10s and 30s, more competition from gold and some from Bitcoin. So a higher term premium is the clearing price of duration in a multi-collateral world, not automatically a 2023 style the bond market is exploding event. And also, there's a number of things that they've done as well that have enabled domestic financial institutions to expand their own treasury capacity as well. So obviously having American institutions buying and holding treasuries has benefits over foreign institutions. And then for policy, Fed owns the overnight, Treasury owns the maturity mix and the exchange stabilization fund / yen style valves. The sanctions gate who gets the rail. So Fed owns the overnight rate, Treasury owns the maturity mix and the sort of interventions in currencies, and then sanctions gate who actually gets access to the system. In that frame, a steepish curve with heavy bill supply is not a transient crisis print. It is what the system looks like when money and duration have been pried apart. It says higher long rates are only a feature if the fiscal path is believed and rollover stays orderly. So in other words, if people believe in the future success and prosperity and upward trajectory of the United States, and the stability of the government, if deficits stay huge, AI and the government keep issuing duration, and foreigners keep diversifying into gold, the 30-year is not a programmable instrument. Bessent's toolkit this month, yen support so Japan doesn't dump coupons, then buybacks on 10s and 30s, is him admitting the long end is still a constraint, not a dashboard slider. Also, substitution. If USDC growth comes out of money market funds that already owned bills, net new bill demand is smaller than the headline stablecoin AUM, or assets under management. So basically, if it's money market funds that are just that were owning bills and now they just own stables instead of bills, then you're not actually getting new bills. The bull case for your thesis is offshore and cash outside the U.S. bank system demand. That is the Luongo / Bessent replace the city rail story. It's not automatic just because AUM goes up. So it says, when bills are well bid and 3s stay contained while 10s and 30s leak higher. Homos. Thank you, Flicker Rate. When bills are well bid and 3s stay contained while 10s and 30s leak higher, that's not one crisis, it's two prices. First, the market will fund the United States overnight and for a quarter. The market will not give you 30 years cheap in a world with gold at market, a formalish BTC pile, and no QE sponge. That's new structure. It's also why just issue more bills is not a free lunch, and why a gold-backed or ultra-long political bond would be a different animal from Genius Stables, a duration product sold as collateral, not a payment token. He has not built that product yet. He has built the front-end rail and left the long end as the thing he still has to wrestle by hand. And then I think there was one other thing I wanted to read here. I can't find it. There was like a particular sentence that I just really liked the way that the clanker phrased it. But I seem to have lost it now. So, oh well. Actually, you know what? Let me try one other thing here. Oh, maybe it was... Yeah, no, whatever. All right. Well, that is the lab that I brought for you today. Hopefully it was enjoyable, informative, useful to you in some way. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to the Erickson Financial Cause today. I will be back tomorrow for the Pseudolab. So make sure you guys show up for that. We will have a Pseudolab, and it's going to be a good one. You are not going to want to miss it. I know what it's going to be. I won't say just yet. I can't remember if he said it publicly. So just make sure you show up tomorrow, probably around the same time, late afternoon, early evening. Join us for the great and glorious Pseudolab. Please do share the show. Let the people know about it. Make sure you go follow the Astrolabe Clips channel. And go join the King Pill Discord. Follow the King Pill Telegram channel, t.me/kingpilled. And make sure you get your ChudCon tickets, chudconevent.com. And last but not least, go over to the new EWBSX platform at beta.ewbsx.com. Create your account, join in the fun. And Melon says, go to ChudCon or gay. You don't want to be gay, do you? I mean, Scott Bessent is gay, but he's got other things going on. He's already gay. Do you want to be gay? Because if you do, then don't go to ChudCon. But if you don't want to be gay, you got to make sure you go to ChudCon. ChudConEvent.com. And beta.ewbsx.com. Go join the new EWBSX platform. Create your account. Enjoy some white pills. Join in the live chat. Post in the forum. Join a clan. Up with the Roogs. Down with the Slendermen and other competitors. Oh, one other thing. Please do, no matter where you're listening to this, please go over to YouTube and like the stream, share the stream, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Then leave me a comment. Try to keep boosting the engagement on the YouTube channel so that we can grow that. I deeply appreciate all of you, and I will be back tomorrow with the Pseudolab. Until then, I leave you with Hulk.
When they took a shot at my hero, and they tried to kill the next president of the United States, enough was enough. And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother. Let Trumpomania rule again. Let Trumpomania